Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Sedecase, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today's episode is very, very special. I have a returning guest, Dr. Joshua Sijuwade. I think this is his third time on, and we're going to be talking about his fantastic book, Analytic Theism, a philosophical investigation. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's a huge book, and you'd be right. And you might be thinking, Analytic Theism, that's not very descriptive. What's it about? Yes, like it's about Analytic Theism. That's why it's so thick. It is super comprehensive in scope. He goes all over the place and covers everything you want to know. It's really, really impressive. It's a magisterial work. I don't know. It's huge and it's awesome. Today, though, we're going to be talking about the scope of metaphysics, the scope of analytic metaphysics. There's so much in the book that we just can't cover. I need like 8 or 9 episodes to just even describe everything that's in here. But we're going to be talking about the state of modern analytic metaphysics. So I think it's going to be really helpful for you, the audience, to get clear on the different subfields in the subfield of of analytic metaphysics. So I'm really excited. We're going to talk about ontology, modality, philosophy of time, causality, free will, the philosophy of mind, all that stuff. So we're just going to broach that, talk about some of the current debates, and then maybe discuss our positions in each of those. So it's going to be a really fun episode. I'm stoked for it. Before we jump in, I want to thank everyone who's making this podcast possible over on Patreon and YouTube members. If you guys like this show, if you learned something, if it's your top 5 or 10 favorite podcasts, please consider becoming a Patreon patron or a YouTube member. You can find those links in the description wherever you're getting this podcast at. If you're watching on YouTube, just click join. That would be awesome. That would help me continue to get books and food for my dogs and my daughter. Let's stop with the commodification. Help me keep the lights on. Let's go in with Dr. Joshua Sijuwade and talk about analytic metaphysics. Josh, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast, man.
Well, thank you, Parker. It's an honor to be invited back. So I'm really grateful, and I know it's going to be a great episode. So thank you so much.
Yeah, man, I'm stoked for it. As we get in here, we're going to be talking about analytic metaphysics. Man, I just wanted a random thought. Is there work being done in continental metaphysics right now? Do you have any idea?
I'm probably the worst, but what you find with a lot of analytic metaphysicians, they have no clue what's going on with their neighbors. So if I'm honest, I don't really know. I'm not a big fan of Continental, and that's not to say anything against Continental
Sure.
philosophy. But I just don't know what's going on in there. So there hopefully is, and there probably is. But yeah, that'll be great because then, two sort of strands of philosophy will be having gone back in the center of the conversation. That'd be good. So hopefully it is the case.
Yeah, and if it's not, you guys, you heard it here. Start it. Let's go. Let's get it. Let's get after it. Continental Theism. All right, dude. This is a huge book, and it looks like it would take you like 10 years to write it, and it didn't because you have other books coming out right now too, and journal articles all the time. You're crushing it. Real quick, man. Again, before we get in, how are you producing so much stuff? Can you help us out? Like, how are you so productive in producing high quality stuff like this?
Yeah, so I would say the first thing is sort of the interest in the subject. So for me, this is I sort of see in a way, my main purpose, what I see that God wants me to be utilized in some way is within the academic context. So I see this as, firstly, I feel that this is my purpose. I'm supposed to be doing this type of work.
Yeah.
But then I actually like this purpose. I actually like what I'm doing. I really enjoy philosophy. I really enjoy theology. I really enjoy these sort of the intersection of these two areas of knowledge. And so having that sort of the thing that I feel that this is what I feel that God is directing me to do. But then on the other hand, I also had a great interest in it. I have such a motivating sort of factor when it comes to actually getting down to the writing and the reading, because I just feel that I really need to be doing this and I want to be doing this. And then secondly, I don't know what it was, but I think it's a latent ability that I actually am okay at writing.
Hmm.
One thing I will always encourage people to do, which I think has helped me a lot now, is learning how to touch type.
Hmm.
When I was at school, when I was younger, they, they would every day or every other day, they'll make us do this exercise of touch typing. oh, I hate this so much. Learning to be able to, write fast without actually looking at the keys. But now looking, years and years later, it's such a great thing. Like I can write very fast.
Mhm.
Whilst I'm thinking through something or reading something, I can just be writing. So it's sort of a physical ability that I've developed through sort of learning how to write quite well through the computer, and then having that motivating factor that have come together to sort of, bring about some of my publications. So yeah, I'm just enjoying it at the moment. Hopefully the water doesn't run dry and I just completely not thinking what I want to do it. But yeah, at the moment I've still got a few other ideas.
That's awesome, man. The typing bit, they made us do some of that too. We actually, me and my friends learned from AOL Instant Messenger because we were
Okay.
like, we'd
Yeah,
be
yeah,
fighting with each other and we'd just be like glued into the screen.
yeah,
So I got super fast at typing because of that. It
yeah,
was really
yeah,
funny.
yeah. And I remember, did you ever use MSN Messenger? Was that
Yeah.
ever? Yeah, MSN Messenger. Yeah, yeah. Those days.
Yeah, dude, that's right.
Oh,
So
well,
I didn't learn how to spell anything, I can type LOL really fast. But
it's actually,
yeah, other than that, dude,
yeah,
that intersection of philosophy and theology is so intriguing to me as well. Like I'll be writing a paper when I was in my philosophy degree, uh, supposed to be about something unrelated to God, and I'd be like, I can't not mention it. It's right here. Just let me sneak it in. Let me just shoehorn it in. It was so hard for me to not do that because I think it's like it's the gem, man. It's what I want to know about is
yeah,
God and the world.
yeah, exactly. And that's sort of my thing. So I sort of fell into philosophy of religion because when I became a Christian when I was very young, so I was 19, so
Mm.
about 13 years ago, I had a religious experience that changed my life. And I wasn't an academic person at all. I was very interested in, I think I mentioned to you before, but I was very interested in American football, even though I
Yeah.
was an that's my
Yep.
main sort of thing. Then I had this religious experience that changed my life, and my direction in life was sort of reorientated around theology, God. I just wanted to know more. But I went into theological college for my first degree. Thinking I was going to be a pastor. That's sort of my main aim. And then one day I was watching William Lane Craig, and I think a lot of people start off with something that they saw with William Lane Craig. I
Hmm.
was watching Christopher Hitchens, and I was like, this is unbelievable. Like how someone can defend Christianity so clearly and so rigorously from a philosophical standpoint. And that sort of just lit a flame in me. Actually, this is a really interesting area, philosophy of religion. And then from that, I've just stayed in it. But I've also realized that philosophy to become, sort of good in philosophy of religion, it's quite a
Yeah.
hard subject that you have to pull from different areas. So you need to sort of to become a mini expert in epistemology or metaphysics or ethics or philosophy of language, philosophy of science. So it just makes you fall into everything.
Yeah.
So I've liked that as well because it's giving me excuses to read things that I probably wouldn't be interested in read if it wasn't because I'm trying to utilize them within a philosophical, philosophy of religion context. So yeah, that's the interesting thing about philosophy of religion, and it's sort of the way that it draws you into different areas of philosophy. You end up falling into things and stuff like that.
Dude, I love that, and I think there's actual there's stakes involved because if I take this philosophical position and nothing really matters, well, who cares? I can just let that go. But if this has implications for my theology, I better get this straight, and I'm gonna try to defend it a little bit more. And yeah, that's why I started the podcast, man, because I'm like,
Yeah,
I need to know so much more philosophy. So let me just ask the experts to help me
yeah,
with meta ethics. I'm like, dude, I would never study that, but there's implications
absolutely,
for God and yeah, moral
exactly.
facts. So, dude, I love it. Well, let's jump in on the scope of metaphysics.
Yeah,
So this just comes from like the introduction of your book, which is wild
yeah,
because it's so packed in there. But you do a really good job, and I think I do see the Swinburne influence there, which you're getting clear on what you're going to be talking about first, and you're going through the philosophy, and then you're going to set up the rest of the book.
yeah,
So in there, I found you go over these eight subdisciplines, or you're carving up metaphysics at its joints, eight
yeah,
different ways. And so I thought it'd be really good for my audience to see the scope of metaphysics, and so that they can get clear on it as well. So you have some PowerPoints for us. Should I pull those
yeah,
up?
yeah, yeah.
Nice,
So
dude. Let's do that. So for those listening, we'll describe it to you, so it's not just a visual thing. But yeah, Josh got some sweet slides for us. I'm stoked.
yeah, thanks very much. So, yeah, what we're going to be looking at is just trying to understand what the nature and scope of metaphysics is, because it's a term which seems a bit weird for a lot of people. What does meta mean? What does physics mean? And so it's good to sort of understand what actually the nature of this important subject is, and what is the range of topics that a lot of people in the contemporary sort of discussion are looking at. So generally, what I would say is when I'm looking at metaphysics, I go with the person called E.J. Lowe and
Mhm.
his definition, because there are different ways that people define metaphysics. But I define it as something which is concerned with the nature and structure of fundamental reality. So you can see sort of other areas, they are sort of, they're looking at the nature of reality, they're looking at the structure of reality, but they're more limited. The thing
Mhm.
about metaphysics is that it's an all-encompassing. So it's not like the natural scientists, where the natural scientists are focusing on the physical structure of reality or the biological structure of reality. But what metaphysics is doing is it's looking at the fundamental nature and structure of reality as a whole. And so this is where you sort of have the problem where a lot of people will be like, we don't need metaphysics, we just need science. But
Mhm.
actually, that's not the case, because metaphysics is the all encompassing field that everything falls into. All of these other ones are sort of compartments of this sort of investigation of the structure of reality. But metaphysics has the tools that enables us to sort of look at the wider range of things and the more deeper structure of things. So the fundamental nature structure of reality, that's sort of what I'm looking at.
I love that.
Um,
Well, Josh, can I jump in on the name?
yes,
Famously, the name has come because someone was collecting Aristotle's works together and was like, "Here's the one that comes after physics." So it's metaphysics. It's after.
yeah,
But dude, I don't know. I kind of like the name. Some people like bemoan the name,
yeah.
but it to me, I'm like, good luck coming up with another one, right? Maybe
Yes,
we already have it, but have you thought of like how else could you describe
yeah,
metaphysics? Just fundamental reality study, or
yeah. I don't know. I mean, yeah, I like it. It also gives you a little bit of I don't know, a little bit of a boost of confidence, because a lot of people like, oh, all about physics. And we're like, oh no, actually, it's like metaphysics,
that's right.
which where you sound like you're even cooler than the physicist. But I
That's
know
right.
I like metaphysics. If I'm honest, the one I don't like is metaphysics. I
Uh,
just don't like that term. I
yeah.
wish they had a different term.
Is
But
that Chalmers? I think Chalmers did that one. It was like, let's call it
yeah, yeah, and it's actually
metaphysics.
caught. Yeah, it's caught on. I mean, people actually use it as a term
Mm.
for a domain of study, and yeah, I just don't like it. But with metaphysics, I think it sounds nice. So yeah,
That's good.
I would keep it if we can.
Nice. All right,
Yeah.
let's keep going here.
Yeah. So then when we look at metaphysics, so we need to understand that there are different ways of doing metaphysics.
Mm.
The one that I sort of focus on, and a lot of people sort of in the Anglo-European, Anglo-American sort of realm of philosophy focus on, is something called analytic metaphysics. Now, this term analytic is a bit of a misnomer. It's a bit of a weird one, because it doesn't really express anything. What it sort of started off with people like Bertrand Russell
Mm.
and others, when they were doing their sort of philosophy of sort of analytic philosophy in that sense. But a lot of analytic philosophers now, analytic metaphysicians, they're not doing the work of what Bertrand Russell is doing. So a lot of the time when people look at analytic philosophy in general, it's normally just meaning that there is a type of philosophy that has a clarity of thoughts and expression. So the way that it's sort of being expressed, the way that it's been argued is quite clear. You're going to understand by the end of the end of the page that you're reading or the book you're reading, you're going to see the premises that are being put forward, the key concepts that are being defined, and there's sort of a rigorous basis to the argumentation. So it's just sort of a style of writing, I would say, that sort of distinguishes people between, let's say, continental and analytic. It could be also topics that are favored,
Yeah.
but a lot of the time, you can sort of have both, topics moving from continental to analytic, and then analytic just being the way that it's sort of expressed. A lot of people see that, but it is sort of a recent evolution of this of sort of metaphysical thinking, which sort of started in the 20th century. So this sort of leads me then to just speak about this important historical context, which I think it's good that we sort of park on here.
Yeah.
If we were living, let's say, about 100 years ago, we will definitely not be having this podcast. Not so much because we wouldn't have the tools to do it and the equipment. It's just because a lot of people would have said this is just nonsensical speech. Because about 100 years or so ago, we were living as philosophers in sort of the positivist era.
Mm.
So this was the time of people who sort of classed themselves as the logical positivists. So they were a group of philosophers. Some of them made up something called the Vienna Circle. And these philosophers, one thing that they were very hot on was the naturalization of philosophy. The idea that philosophy needs to be grounded upon our best empirical studies and scientific thinking. And so we shouldn't be really looking and speaking about anything which is speculative and unverifiable. And so for them, metaphysics was something which was taken to be just an unverifiable speculative field. And so it's nonsensical. We shouldn't be wasting our time in the classrooms, in the lecture halls, or in our day-to-day speech talking about these type of areas. And something which was at the ground of that was something called the verification principle.
Mm.
So this was a principle that was put forward, which was the idea that a proposition or a statement is only meaningful if it is verifiable or it is tautological. So if you can see it or you can sense it with your five senses, or it's a tautological statement, then it's something which has meaning. But
Yeah.
anything outside of that is something which lacks meaning. So
So like a bachelor, unmarried bachelor, like
yeah,
it's a tautology for
yes,
those who don't aren't familiar.
yes, exactly. And so tautologies, also mathematical statements like logical truths, those sort of things will be acceptable. Or things I can verify, like the sky is blue, I can directly verify that. And so we would say things like our sense impressions, observable objects, those are the only things that we should be talking about. Everything else about reality is just meaningless. And so we shouldn't be wasting our time on that. And so that sort of was a big influence in the early part of the 20th century, going into the mid 20th century as well. But then what happened, or what people see was happening, was that there was a critique of the verification, because I don't know why they never noticed this in the first place.
Right.
But a lot of people did at some point notice that the verification principle just seems to be incoherent because it's not verifiable by its own criteria. So if it says a statement is meaningful because it is verifiable directly or it is tautological, someone can just say, well, is the verification principle any of those two things? And it's not. And so it just seems to be self-defeating. But then secondly, as well, it seems to be quite restrictive of certain areas of knowledge. So even though they were trying to ground philosophy upon a scientific basis, they were grounding it upon a basis which actually wasn't favorable to the verification principle, because a lot of scientific theories and things that we put forward are not directly verifiable, neither are they tautological. So even scientific statements are rendered as meaningless.
Yeah.
So a lot of people are saying it's just too restrictive and it seems to be contradictory. So we need to get rid of the verification principle. And so also, whilst that was happening, we then had other developments that were taking place in the field of philosophy. We started having people who were starting to focus on the area called modal logic, which is sort of studying possibility and necessity and different ways to sort of understand that. There was also a further classification of philosophy of language. And this was sort of being birthed in a way which was not now focusing on things about verifiability. Was trying to understand, what do we actually mean as such when we use terms like meaning, reference, communication. And so you had things like rigid designation and stuff like that being put forward. So there were sort of developments going on. And this was happening whilst other people uh, who were not logical positivists was actually starting to grow in the prestige in the field. So you had people like Quine, you had people like Kripke, and you had people like David Lewis. And they in their own selves were putting forward metaphysical ideas which were not actually in line with the verification ideal of only things being grounded upon empirical reality. So because we have these developments in the philosophical field and we have these key contributors who were really, really pushing the field forward, people like Quine, Kripke, and Lewis, we started having an opening to metaphysical thinking again and metaphysical theorizing. So really from the mid 20th century onwards, we sort of had a rebirth of metaphysics, where people now were able to sort of come out the closet as such and say,
Mhm.
you know, I'm a metaphysician and I want to research about this. I want to talk about this. I want to write books about this. And you have people really going into deep reads with metaphysics. If you look at people like David Lewis and, you know, his Plurality of Worlds book, you know, you're talking about real hard metaphysics there. And that was not acceptable a few years before that. So yeah, you sort of see this progress and this opening of the field again.
Yeah, it's awesome, and now it's just exploding and this wild, wild west. I always hear people who are proponents of a particular theorist, or philosopher or thinker, they love being like, and this thinker that I've studied my whole life was integral in taking down the logical positivists. So, like, a really obscure one now is Michael Polanyi and his, tacit dimension type stuff, and people be like, Polanyi, took down logical positivists, or like someone who studied a lot of Gödel will be like, yeah, he went to the Vienna Circle meetings, but his incompleteness stuff totally wrecked their view on logicism and stuff. And so I love that, actually. I love just collecting people who are critiquing the Vienna Circle. But I wonder, in your mind, were, were one of these thinkers like integral in taking down the
Yeah.
circle? Like, would it be Lewis then, or what do you think?
Yeah, so I would say quite.
Oh
I
yeah, okay,
just like his approach, his critiques, specifically of the verification principle, and just his general way of doing philosophy. I think that was probably the thing that really opened up that Pandora's box of metaphysics.
yeah,
I think he just sort of, but because he was so powerful the way that he wrote,
yeah,
um, and very clear as well. So a lot of people, I think, just started saying, you know what, actually, there's maybe something to do with metaphysics. It hasn't just been, buried by logical positivism. And then you have obviously Kripke coming out
yeah.
with naming and necessity, and you sort of have just a complete radicalization of philosophy of language, uh, and regeneration of metaphysical thinking as well. And then you sort of having capping off with David Lewis, who then
Yeah, so they opened the door for Lewis to do
the
what he
really
did.
open those doors, yeah, yeah. But
Yeah,
I would say probably Quine for me. And then it's interesting, and what I do look in the book as well, you have, sort of in a correspondence to this, you have this happening with philosophy of religion as well, with people like Plantinga, people
right.
like Swinburne, and they're doing that type of similar thing, taking on logical positivism with their own words. So it's quite interesting that there's a lot of pushback, and then both fields are sort of live areas there.
I love that. Yeah. So when I was in seminary, people were like, "Yeah, Plantinga ended it," and then I talked to secular philosophers, and like, "Who's Plantinga?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, all right. Well, yeah, it's everyone kind of working together and
Exactly.
taking this
Yeah,
thing
yeah.
down."
Yeah, it's collaborative. I think, definitely.
Yeah, which is fantastic. All right,
Yeah.
well, let's continue
So
on here.
yeah, so now we're going to look at the different areas of metaphysics. So this is sort of again looking at it from an analytic perspective and trying to understand what a lot of people are sort of researching at the moment, and what they're discussing, and the various areas that are related to contemporary metaphysics. So the first thing is ontology. So ontology is just a branch of philosophy that investigates the nature of existence. And there are certain key questions that people raise when they are sort of researching into ontology. So those will be things like, sort of you have the debate between concrete and abstract objects. Are there concrete objects? Are there abstract objects? You'll probably have debates about properties in this field as well. Are they universal? So you have that realism, anti-realism, nominalism debate that will fall into this area as well. And then you also have the debate about the nature and existence of ontological categories. So this is something which I believe is quite important, and it's sort of taken uh, it's taken a hold of a lot of I would say Aristotelian leaning philosophers at the moment, where they'll be sort of arguing for the nature and existence of ontological categories. But a lot of ontology is sort of looking at these areas. Are there abstract objects? Are there concrete objects? Are there properties? What type of properties are there? What's the nature of properties? And are there these ontological categories that exist within reality that all these sort of entities fall under?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, just as I was saying, you sort of have that. I would say the key thing with that question would be the nominalism and realism debate. But you then have, with this sort of thing as well, you have Quine having a great amount of influence in the development of ontology. So you have, a lot of people know about his naturalized epistemology, where he was, I mean, in a similar way to the logical positivist, seeing that we need to sort of be conversant with science when we're doing our metaphysics. We shouldn't just be completely out of the loop. So he would sort of question the a priori approach to doing philosophy. And he would say that actually there needs to be an empirical grounding to our sort of thinking when we are saying what does exist within reality. And this, a lot of people would sort of see Quine when it comes to stuff like the indispensability argument for abstract objects, so specifically mathematical objects. So a lot of people who are studying ontology and sort of approaching into the philosophy of mathematics will find people like Quine being quite important in sort of this debate about do mathematical objects exist? Also, the best scientific theories, do they require the existence of these abstract objects and stuff like that? So ontology has a sort of broad scale, and Quine has had quite a bit of influence in this area.
Yeah, dude, I was so glad to see you make a distinction here. So often I would talk to older philosophers who are they're a little tired, I think, of the just debating how many new students come through and want to debate you on stuff, and so many people would just obfuscate between metaphysics and ontology and say that's the same thing. I'm like, no, it's not. Like metaphysics is the study of reality, and ontology is like that's being. So
Yeah,
those things can come apart. So I was so glad to see that you like this distinction as well, because it just does pick out what's going on in the philosophy. It's not like you made it up. It's like, no, here's a bunch of conversations about being, which is not necessarily the same thing as the fundamental nature of reality.
exactly.
It's a subset, right? It's a
Yeah,
subcategory.
exactly. Yeah, that's the way. So where I sort of divide philosophy is just in. I mean, you have the sort of philosophy of basically
Mhm.
everything. I mean,
Yep.
philosophy of mathematics, science, probably philosophy of gardening. There's everything.
There's
But sort
also
of the,
philosophy of philosophy, which is amazing,
yeah,
right? Like
exactly,
meta
exactly.
philosophy. Yeah.
But you have sort of the three categories that most people say. You've got metaphysics, you have epistemology, and you have ethics. And then within metaphysics, yeah, ontology is just one of those subcategories where we're sort of focusing in more on what do we mean when we use the word existence? What are we actually using that term to refer to?
Yeah.
And so that goes into the concrete debate and abstract objects and realism, nominalism, and ontological categories. Yeah, so just sort of moving on with this as well with ontology, something I do want to show people is how much of a live field it is.
Mm.
So uh, one of the debates I was speaking about just before was the idea about ontological categorical systems. So one area that people research into is the nature and existence of ontological categories. And so you have a lot of philosophers who are actually working on this area now, where they will put forward different ontological systems. So, for example, you have Michael Lowe's constituent ontology. You have Bueno's no category ontology, where he'll say that actually you don't need any categories that exist within reality. You have N.A. Paul's one category ontology, but there's only one category in existence.
Mhm.
Banning Wagon's Armstrong's two category ontologies. So sort of when you have those substance attributes ontology. You have Barry Smith's three category ontology. You have Johansson's nine category ontology. And then you have E.J. Lowe's full category ontology. So if you see, there's a lot of philosophers who are sort of working on ontology and actually saying we need to, within our sort of metaphysical systems, take into account actually a lot of types of entities. The one I personally favor, the one that sort of features in my book, is Lowe's four category ontology.
Mhm.
And so his ontology sort of categorizes things into four categories. So you have kinds, you have attributes, you have objects, and you have modes. And so everything that exists within reality is going to fall into one of those categories.
Can
But
you go
then
over those one more time, Josh?
is that EJ Lowe? Sorry, one.
Yeah, those 4. Can you just list those again?
Yeah, yeah. So EJ Lowe, a great thing if anyone wants to search up is something called the ontological square. So if you
Okay.
ever type that in, you'll see actually the picture of it. So you have four categories of existing things within reality. So you have kinds, you have attributes, you have objects, and you have modes. Okay, just to understand those a little bit more. So basically, it's interesting with his ontology that he believes in universals and tropes.
Yeah.
So normally people just take either you have a trope theoretic system or you have a system that predicates that sort of utilizing universals. But he sees that actually there's a lot of need for both types of entities. So let's say just a running example of this, you have a tomato. So I know I'm British, you might need to make your own word.
I
Uh,
wasn't
so
gonna say anything, but yeah.
okay. So you have a tomato, you have you have this object, tomato. So that will fall into the category of tomato. Sorry, will fall into the category of object. And that object, the tomato, is an instance of the kind tomato. So
Mhm.
every object is going to be an instantiation of that specific kind. So objects are related to the kinds by a relation of instantiation. But then you have the kind, and then you move up the square. So you move from object to kind, object to kind. And then from the kind, you move to the side to attributes. So attributes are things like redness or the shape of a tomato. So all of those attributes will then characterize the specific kinds. So what's different with Lowe's ontology is that an object doesn't actually instantiate any of those attributes. So redness, being a certain shape, being a certain taste, all of those things are going to be characterizers of the category of the kinds.
Mhm.
So we have the tomato instantiating the kind. The kind is then characterized by the attributes. that we make up that make up a tomato. But then the attributes of redness and all those sort of things, they are then going to be instantiated by modes.
Mhm.
So there'll be a mode of redness, a mode of the taste, the mode of the shape of the tomato. And that one is then linked up to the object. So then you have the square being completed. You have then the modes characterizing that specific object. So what you have here is that the object is a kind, falls into a kind, it is also characterized by modes.
Mhm.
And modes are instances of the attributes of redness or all those sort of things. And they characterize the kind.
Yeah.
So what you have, yeah. Sorry.
Well, dude, you've explained that before, and I just could not figure like I couldn't figure out how you're mixing and matching. But this is so helpful using the tomato. Uh,
Yeah.
this is really good. So, just really quick, like I think there are green tomatoes as well. I think that's like a breed of tomatoes. Would that because the kind is being characterized by the attributes and not the object itself? Would you have to say that the green tomato is a different kind than the red tomato?
No, not necessarily. So you probably when it comes to the attributes, you probably say there are certain essential attributes
Okay.
that characterize the kind, and there might be some non-essential attributes that also characterize the kind. So
Mhm.
some of them will be characterized by that non-essential attribute, and some will not. So they'll probably fall into the same kind because what makes them part of that kind is that they instantiate the kind that is characterized by those specific essential attributes. But then the greenness of it might be a non-essential one that it just has, for example.
So that non-essential attribute is not necessarily um, it's not at the kind level that's being instantiated. So does that mean it like the mode takes on a different attribute because this one is green, this one is red, and is that
Yeah,
at the mode level or is that at the kind level?
yeah. So he'll still be characterizing the kind. He'll
Okay.
still have it characterizing the kind. So you have all the attributes characterizing the kind, but there will be things within tomatoes, the kind tomato, that some of them have the non-essential attribute of being red, and
Okay.
some of them have the non-essential attribute of being green. And then the mode will then just be characterizing that specific particular tomato as green or red.
Cool.
But because it's not essential, they characterize the kind, but some of them have it, some don't have it.
Okay. Dude,
Yeah.
that's good. I'm I'm trying not to be triggered by the instantiation language and not exemplification language because I'm a Platonist myself,
Yeah.
so I
So
like the exemplification. But
what
does
is
that fit in
interesting?
at all? Yeah.
Yeah. So what is interesting is that exemplification is still a relation here.
Mhm.
But what happens if you can picture the square in your mind and you have attributes there and you have objects at the bottom? Objects exemplify the attributes.
Okay, there
But
we go.
exemplification is broken up into that it's sort of a derivative relation. So you exemplify the attributes by either being an instance of the kind, which is characterized by that attribute,
Mhm.
that's that square, or you exemplify it by having a mode that is an instance of that kind of that attribute which characterizes you. So
Yeah.
you possess it through exemplification, but in two ways, either through kind instantiation or through being characterized by a mode.
Gotcha. So exemplification is composed of other parts which
Yes,
include
other
instantiation.
relations. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
relations.
instantiation and characterization will be more fundamental than
That's
exemplification.
cool, man. That's just fun. That's
Yeah,
really
it
nice. I
is.
like that.
Yeah, so Low put forward this ontology to make sense of natural science. So for him, he gave like an account of the natural law. So instead of you having to utilize Armstrong's view of laws, nature, he put forward his own idea, and then other things as well about disposition. So it's actually quite a powerful ontology. It's just a shame because he passed away, I think it's 2013 or so. And philosophy is a long game. So book was published in 2006. But I think if he was still around, there would be a lot more discussion
Hmm.
about sort of this category ontology. So unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of people developing it. I myself have sort of done it in the philosophy of religion area, but I would say in metaphysics itself, it's not really being spoken about a lot. So a lot of people are moving to like the no category ontology or the one category ontology or stuff like that. But I feel there's so much to gain with Lowe's own ontology.
Something that's a little bit odd that I've noticed as I got into philosophy is how trendy it is, and theology resists that a little bit because of the historical component, just a
Yeah.
little bit. We're still pretty trendy, but in the philosophy world, I got into I was talking about like reasons because I really like the argument from reason, and I got in a little bit late, and people are like, "Oh yeah, that was pretty big a few years ago," and I'm like, "What do you mean a few years ago? What are you talking like?" how did it move on that fast? Or like people be like, you remember the whole grounding thing? And I'm like, I'm still here. I still like grounding. What do you mean? No, I'm not moving on from it. But it's just funny where the trends go and
Yeah,
how quickly people move on. Like, yeah, that's old hat, man. That's
exactly,
3 years
exactly.
ago.
Yeah, and you'll see that as we go forward, because there is sort of this. It's even in philosophy, religion, not just metaphysics. So you'll have, for example, in the early 21st century, everything was hot on this warrant idea by Plantinga,
Yeah.
warrants and all those sort of things. But if you look at a lot of the journals now, a lot of people aren't publishing on that, and it's not a
Mhm.
lot of work that's being done on it. So people have moved to, I don't know, different areas. But with metaphysics, you sort of see that, and I'm going to sort of speak about that when we go to modality and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay, there's are tropes are they abstract objects?
But no, they're concrete.
Okay.
They're concrete. Yeah, so it's a strange one. So classical trope theory, they define a trope as an abstract particular nature. So
Mhm.
it's not very helpful that that word abstract is in that. But yeah, Williams, so DC Williams, who sort of was the originator of this theory, what he meant by abstract was the entity doesn't take up its whole location. So it's a really weird word. Like, I just don't know why, because it doesn't mean what we normally mean by it now, with
Right.
being non-spatial temporal or causally inert. But what it meant for him was an abstract entity, in the sense of a trope, is one that can have other entities existing within it.
Mhm.
So abstract nature would be, let's say, a trope like a redness trope that can exist in the tomato with also a weight trope or things like that. And that's what makes it abstract. It just doesn't take up its whole location. But they are concrete objects because there are things which can stand in causal relations. So
Yeah.
tropes, for example, if you burn your hand, and there will be a heatness trope that's caused you to have that burn mark, and that would be that'll show that it's concrete.
Yeah. So for the folks listening, this I understand that this can be confusing, especially if you're thinking about material and immaterial things. So like I have a immaterial soul. Is that abstract? No, it's not abstract. It's concrete because it can cause abstract objects are said to be causally inert. They don't do anything. They don't cause things to happen. So my soul causes my brain to do certain things and wire my synapses a certain way and vice versa. But it's immaterial yet it's concrete. So don't get confused by that. There's a lot of categories going on, which is fun, man. I,
Exactly.
I love this. But
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say for your listeners, in the audience, just to sort of investigate these different ontologies, because a lot of people fall into one of them.
Mm,
So it's good actually knowing what's the sort of ontological basis for what you view. Like if you do hold to tropes, you don't, if you're nominalist, you'll probably fall into one of these types of categories, maybe a no category ontology, one category, or maybe even go into the nine category ontology and stuff like that. So
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I do. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, I'll
Yeah.
let you continue on here.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move on to modality. So the second area of
Mm,
metaphysics that we're looking at. So modality, just in a simple level, is the study of possibility and necessity and other related notions. And it sort of took a hold of metaphysics by the development of modal logic. So this was advanced significantly by Saul Kripke. I think he passed away recently. Or was it last year
yeah.
or something?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So Saul Kripke, very, very influential philosopher and metaphysician. And he, through his work, was sort of developing this with others as well, modal logic, and this sort of expanded the field of modality. The key questions you sort of look at when you are looking at modality are things about possible worlds. So you'll see this word, come up a lot, these two words, possible world. And, do they exist? What are they? What's their nature? What do we mean by the word possibility? What does it mean for something to be possible? What does it mean for something to be necessary? Um, so there's sort of a distinction when it comes to modality, or something called the metaphysics of modality and the epistemology of modality, and then also modal logic itself.
Mhm.
So when we're looking at the metaphysics of modality, we're sort of answering those questions of, do possible worlds exist? What are their nature? What are the theories that we put forward? Best understand possibility and necessity. And then the epistemology of modality, sort of trying to say, how do we know what is possible? How do we know what is necessary and stuff like that? And so, sort of the key theories that were developed within the latter parts of the 20th century was David Lewis's modal realism. So this really took a hold of metaphysics whilst Lewis was alive. And if you actually look up things like the ranking of philosophers, I think there's a Stanford, there was like a specific tallying of the amount of citations. And I think David Lewis was number one uh, for like Stanford and Encyclopedia citations and other repeatable citations. So you can understand that Lewis was very, very, very influential in
Mhm.
philosophy in general. But what a lot of people haven't liked is his modal realism.
Mhm.
A lot of people have liked it in that it's very interesting, but there's probably I actually think there's three people who actually hold to modal realism.
Yeah.
So Philip Bricker, he modified it. Chris McDaniel modified it. I don't actually know if he believes it, but he modified it. And there was another guy, what is it? I think there's only like a handful of people who
Yeah.
Lewis has as disciples. But modal realism, one, a lot of people can't really stomach it because it's the idea that there are a near infinite amount of concrete worlds that exist.
Mhm.
So the worlds that exist that we were talking about are just as real as our own world. Now, when I'm using the word world, I'm not just referring to the earth, I'm referring to the totality of existence. Whatever we take to exist within our sort of realm of reality, that could be a universe, that could be the multiverse, whatever that is, that makes up one world. And Lewis believed that there was a near infinite amount of these worlds that exist, of what he calls the pluriverse. So the pluriverse, you have a near infinite amount of worlds. Now, someone might say, "Well, why did Lewis, think of this crazy, crazy sort of idea? Why did he come up with this?" Because he believed that he wanted to put forward a reductive view of modality. He didn't want to have any primitive modal terms. So, well, if we can put forward a theory that is able to reduce the number of primitive terms we use, we should favor that theory. So he sort of believed that it's the most economical theory, even though um, quantitatively it's very, complex. It's not simple. Quantitatively, it is because we're just positing things like our world, but it also plays a role in reducing modality to things which actually exist within the concrete realm of reality.
Mm.
We had to ground all of our modal statements upon things within other possible worlds, which are like ours.
Yeah, so it's like, so how do I know that my dog could have been, brown instead of black? Well, there's a concrete world where I have a brown dog, and
Yes,
he's not actually not black. It's
yeah.
not just a state of affairs that I can think about. It's an obtaining state of affairs. It's a fact in a different world
Yes.
right now.
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting, just to sort of further specify, it won't even this sort of moves on to the second part of this counterpart theory. It won't even be you that
Yeah,
had
that's
that
right.
dog. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a counterpart of you. So Lewis had this idea that we have these things which are extraordinarily similar to us, not identical to us, but they are so similar to us, and they're basically like duplicates of us that existing in these other worlds, and they are the grounds for our modal statements.
Mhm.
So, for example, like you said about your dog, there is a counterpart of your real dog now, a duplicate of it that's existing in another world has a different color. Or, you could say that Socrates, was a painter. Even though he wasn't a painter, I don't know if you get that in this spare time, but
Mhm.
um, he was a philosopher in our actual world, but within another concrete world, there is Socrates as a duplicate of him, so a counterpart of him, that is a painter and is not a philosopher.
Yeah.
Just another thing that's important as well is every world is actual. So this is quite important. So there isn't a an objective form of actuality. So normally we say our world is actual and all of these other possible worlds are non-actual. Well, Lewis didn't see it that way. He saw actuality as an indexical notion. So actuality is the same as here. If I
Mhm.
say to you here, that word is true because it picks out whatever I'm speaking, whoever is the speaker. So actuality is the same thing. Our world is actual for us, but it's non-actual for other people that are other counterparts in the other worlds, and it's actual for them.
Yeah.
And so he just had that sort of weird view as well.
Which is such a fun thing. So indexical folks is like I here, they index things, right? So like I think therefore I am is an
Yeah.
indexical statement about existence. And so Lewis is like, well, no, actual is also an indexical, which is just
Yes.
like I
Yeah.
it's crazy, he always said people gave him the incredulous stare. They looked at him like, "What? What are you talking about?" But it's just
Yeah.
so fun to think about. The pluriverse is like DC Comics omniverse of all the
Yes.
possible. Like, it's just fun, dude. It's really fun, and when you see the kind of work that it does, it's at least for a second, you're like, maybe that's pretty interesting, and then you go back to the incredulous stare and be like, maybe not, dude. I'm not sure.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so in my second book, so not the book that we're speaking about, my second book, which is on the ontological argument, I'm actually putting an ontological argument that utilizes modal realism, but it's a very different form of modal
Yeah,
realism, Lewis.
dude.
Just there's some problems. So a lot of people like what Lewis is doing, but they just like the people who have defended him would just say it just seems to be either the counterpart relation doesn't seem to make sense, the actuality of this doesn't seem to make sense, or something else doesn't seem to make sense. So there's no one who's really bought the whole package of what
Right.
Lewis is trying to sell. But it is interesting because when I was reflecting on, like the Marvel universe and stuff like that, it is very eerily similar to what Lewis is saying because you have all of these sort of counterparts of
Mm,
Spider-Man or of the other superheroes who are showing up, and those are sort of they are popping up from these other worlds. And
mm,
the only difference with Lewis is that Lewis believed that every world is spatio-temporally isolated.
yeah,
So that's the only difference between that and what we see with the multiverse in the Marvel world.
it's a bummer.
But as you can see, it's actually sort of filtering in some way to these different areas. So it is quite interesting.
Yeah, it's
Um,
super. Well, so we had talked about the ontological argument, because I was thinking about at the time I was thinking about planning a modal ontological argument, and I thought, hey, I just discovered Lewis's counter or his realism
yeah,
about possible worlds. And I was like, well, that if there's a possible world where there's a necessary being, or the greatest possible being, or whatever, then he exists in all possible worlds. So did Lewis just walk in? And so we had a really fun conversation about that back in the day. I'll put a
yeah,
link in
yeah,
the description for folks, but it was just so cool to see. I kind of stumbled on that, and you'd already been there, like doing some hardcore work and
yeah.
all of that. So it was super helpful for me to discover that,
No,
like,
thank you,
you've
thank
been
you.
on it, man.
Yeah, no, I do really appreciate that, and hopefully the book which comes out early next year, hopefully will have some contribution to the field with your
So good,
ontological.
man. I love that. Well, real quick, so counterparts, we don't have to talk too much about this, but I've always been confused about them, as a lot of people are, but I just don't see how my counterpart in even a near possible world can ground can be the ground of like the my possible choices or anything like that, because it's unless we're sharing this unless we're both an exemplification or an instantiation of the same kind of like Parker nature, in which case I think there kinda would be an identity, thing
Yeah.
going on. So, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, how
Yeah,
to
so
yeah.
so this is one of the main objections that was put forward by Kripke. So he used an example of a presidential race. So let's sort of bring it up to date with ours. So let's say you have Donald Trump, and let's say Donald Trump doesn't win the 2024 presidential election, um, or let's say he does win, whichever one you take. What Kripke was saying is that let's say we say in our real world Donald Trump didn't win it, but in another world a counterpart of Donald Trump did win it. We're just changing the topic because um, even though we might say it's possible that Donald Trump won it
Mhm.
because his counterpart did win it, that counterpart, they're not identical. There's non-identity relation here. There is just a similarity. So it's literally like if I had a twin who won a medal in the race, does that mean that I, have
Right.
somehow had some bearing on that? No, I didn't. So why does a counterpart have any bearing on things within other worlds? So yeah, people have just had a problem with actually it doesn't seem to be robust enough as a grounding for on modal statements.
Mm.
So I think Lewis's pushback was just that it does. I think it was
That's
sort of
good.
my understanding of him is just that he just seems to be that we are still talking about the real person, even though it's a counterpart.
Yeah.
So I just don't think he gave real grounding for us to actually see it. But that was Kripke's main pushback on it. And a lot of people, so it's called a Humphrey objection. So
Okay.
a lot of people have sort of developed that sort of line of thinking.
That's good.
I
I
think
think
I think the main thing with against Lewis is just being incredulous there.
yeah.
I think that's the main thing that people say. It just doesn't seem plausible,
Yeah.
no matter how you paint it.
I love that. I think you do you have another modality, probably like on essentialism or something?
Yeah, exactly. So just sort of moving forward here. So now this is just sort of looking at the alternative approaches to modality. So
Nice.
this is sort of giving the alternatives that people have looked at when they've looked at the aspects of what it means for something to be possible, what it means for something to be necessary. So we have people like Plantinga. So this was a similar time to Lewis. He put forward his idea of abstractionism. So this is sort of the general idea, and a lot of philosophers of religion themselves probably would favor this
Yeah.
because it fits with his modal ontological argument. But it's just the idea that, yes, there is a pluriverse of these possible worlds, but the possible worlds are abstract entities. They are states of affairs. So what Plantinga does here, because Plantinga is a Platonist in a certain sense,
Hmm.
he believes that there are these existing worlds. They do exist, but they're non-actual. All that they exist as are these abstract objects, which are states of affairs. But there is one state of affairs, which we deem the actual world, which is being the actualized state of affairs. So a state of affairs is just, again, the totality of everything
Hmm.
that makes up something. And so when you have the totality of the state of affairs, it makes up different states of affairs that make up this complete state of affairs. You then have a world,
Yeah.
and then one of those worlds, which is our world, has been actualized. Now, he will obviously say that God actualized it. You don't have to hold to that. There just is one actual world. And so he still goes with Lewis with the possible world semantics, but he wouldn't concretize any of the worlds. He would say they're just these abstract objects. They don't really exist in a concrete form. There's only one that does exist, and that's our real world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I,
So
I I love that. I'm pretty like deep into the planning and stuff on that. Like
yes.
I absolutely love his abstract stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. And a lot of people will end up taking that approach. If they do go in possible worlds, they probably will go with the abstract approach. So you have people like him. Also, Robert Adams was a defender of this as well. But there are some challenges that people have put forward.
Mhm.
Firstly, it sort of commits you to abstract objects. So if you're not a big fan of abstract objects, then what do you really do with the worlds? What ontologically are these worlds? Some people, like Lewis himself, would say that there seems to be issues with um, these worlds having any relevance to our world.
Mhm.
So how do these worlds actually fulfill the role of grounding our modal statements? Like, why do they have any relation to our worlds? They seem to be irrelevant
Mhm.
in the discussion. So that's what he would say. Also, it requires us to hold to primitive modality. So
Mhm.
if you remember what I was saying with Lewis, he's trying to have a reductive approach to modality. But if you hold to this idea, you have primitive modal notions. So that was a problem during as well. So there was sort of a pushback between him and Plantinga during the 70s. A lot of people sort of went with Plantinga on that approach and against Lewis. But Lewis did have his own sort of arguments against it. But then what a lot of people will understand, if you're sort of in the contemporary field of metaphysics at the moment, people have sort of moved away from possible world semantics.
Mhm.
So a lot of people who are doing modality at the moment now, they sort of have moved away from the discussions that you would have found in the 70s, 80s, 90s about modality. So there's sort of a post-modality phase where a lot of people are saying, why do we need possible worlds? Let's
Mhm.
even be more reductive in our approach. Let's get rid of all these esoteric worlds, and let's try and ground modality in things which you can actually uh, see to have real or have some real form in the actual world. So what they will do is they'll move into something called essentialism or a dispositionalism type of modality. So
Mhm.
you have essentialism, which was put forward by a guy called Kit Fine. So very, 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 very one of probably the most prominent metaphysician working at the moment. In that he's written not a lot of stuff, but when he has written, it's changed the field.
Yeah.
And he did that. So, like for example, we'll go on to grounding, and it really was Kit Fine who rediscovered ground,
Mhm.
and then made everyone go crazy about it. But it's the same thing with essentialism. So in the early 1990s, Kit Fine wrote just a few papers where he put forward certain counterexamples which seem to break the link between um, necessity and essence. So a
Mhm.
lot of people used to see that essence and necessity are sort of identical notions. So an essential truth is a necessary truth, a necessary truth is an essential truth. But what Kit Fine was doing, specifically through his famous example of Socrates and the singleton set,
Oh yeah.
yeah, so that really famous one. He was actually the one who sort of put it forward. So he showed that. So it's very much the case that in order for Socrates to exist, his singleton set also exists. It's necessarily the case, but it doesn't seem to be essential to Socrates that his singleton exists. So if I was listing all of the things that make up Socrates, what he is, it doesn't seem to be that I'll put also there is a single set
Yeah.
of that he's he's member of. That doesn't seem to be the case, but it is necessarily the case that that singleton set exists if Socrates exists. So what he was trying to show is that essential truths are not always the case necessary truths.
Mhm.
So he was trying to flip the script and say, actually, the ground of necessity is essence.
Mhm.
What is essentially the case is necessarily the case. Not what necessarily the case also has to be essentially the case.
Yeah. So
So
essential attributes are are necessary, but not all necessary attributes are essential.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
That's a very good
Yeah.
way to put it. So what he would say is the essence of something is what it is to be that thing.
Yeah.
So what we will find in a real, him and others call it a real definition. So what it means when we define an entity, that is what makes up the essence. And when
Mhm.
we define what Socrates is, we're not going to find the signals to set there. And so that's why it's not an essential truth. And
Mhm.
so just through these counterexamples, he was able to sort of rebirth this field of essentialism, which you'll find in other Aristotelians in the past. But he brought it back to the contemporary discussion. And so for him, he believed then that the ground of our possibility statements or our statements about necessities are the essences of things.
Mm.
So whatever is essentially the case is what is necessarily the case. And then what's possible for someone. So what's possible for your dog is what is not constrained by their essence. So if
Mm.
their essence allows it to be true of that person or that being, then it's possible that that being has that attribute. So it's possible for your dog to have a different color because its essence doesn't stop it from having that color. But it's not possible for your dog to lack space, for example,
Yeah.
because the essence of a dog doesn't allow it to have that attribute.
Don't so yeah, I'm like behind the times here too, but don't we discover essential properties through possible world semantics by saying like, well, how do you know this is one of my essential attributes? Well, because there's no possible world where you don't have it and still be you. Or
Yeah.
and I guess just because you're using that tool I mean you could still have the direction going from essential to
Yeah.
but do we still use possible world semantics to discover like how do we discover essential attributes?
Yeah, so then that's the discussion about the epistemology
Yeah.
of modality. So this is an issue that some people have in that how do we know that things have essences? So people like E.J. Lowe, again, who's a really big proponent of this essentialism, he would say that we know essences in sort of in a priori fashion because we can only make sense of things like identity statements through understanding essences,
Hmm.
but we don't need possible worlds. You can use possible worlds if you want as a heuristic device,
Yeah.
but they're unnecessary. That's what they're saying. And so there's no point bringing them in. What's essential for a being is just what it is to be that being. So whatever makes up, whatever proposition needs to be true for me to be that thing, whatever property I have that makes me what I am, that's an essential.
Mm.
And so with Socrates, for example, it would be being a human or being, being warm-blooded or whatever. These are attributes that make him what he is. He can't be a human without being warm-blooded or being blah, blah, blah. So there'll be certain attributes that are part of his definition.
Yeah.
So if we have them in the definition, that's what's needed. So you don't need possible worlds. You can use it if you want, but they'll just say it's just a heuristic device that's not really necessary.
Yeah. Okay, that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
Um, Another one. This is like just on the periphery of my understanding. Have you thought much about like the branching possibility type stuff that some people are pulling from neo Aristotelians and stuff?
Yeah, so that sort of falls into that's a good segue to the dispositional
Okay.
modality. So that sort of falls into this idea. So dispositional modality is I would say is even more hot at the moment as a ground for modality, dispositional truths and statements than essentialism, even though they're both sort of the main things that people hold to, either you're essentialist or you're dispositionalist. But dispositions is just saying basically that our modal statements, our modal properties, are grounded in our dispositions or powers.
Yeah.
So whatever dispositions or powers I have are the things that make things possible for me or necessary for me. So if I have the power to do something, that allows me to have the possibility to do it. Now, a very important person is a person called Barbara Vetter, where she wrote a book called Potentialities.
Mhm.
And she sort of, I would say, probably has the best treatment of dispositional modality, where she really spends a long time going through trying to show how potentialities can provide grounds for our modal statements. So whatever potentialities I have, whatever potencies, dispositions, whatever you want to call them, whatever I have, they're the things that the set of dispositions I have allow possible statements to be made of me or necessary statements to be made of me. So they are the grounds instead of our essences.
Do is that like is that at odds with essentialism? Couldn't you say like, well, my my powers are grounded in my essence?
Yeah, so you can, but Barbara Vetter herself has actually written an article where she shows that in a priority ordering sense, dispositions are more important than essentially essences for grounding modality. So her herself, she would argue saying actually you don't need both. You just dispositions are the ones we should go with. So I would say she would say no, but then some people are open to saying, yeah, the dispositions I have are what make me what I am. So that's what my essence is. And so
Mm.
that's what grounds modality. So I think there is sort of room to work with both. And with the book itself, I do hold to dispositions, I do hold to essences.
Yeah.
So there's room also for within that metaphysical system.
I love
Uh,
that,
but
dude. Yeah, and
yeah,
you pull in so much. You're always like a yes and guy. Like you read through and
yeah,
yeah, I'll take some
yeah,
tropes too. I'll take some of that. Yeah,
yeah. I think
we'll
that's
add
the
that in.
best way. I think that's the
It's
best
so
way.
good. I love that.
Um, Yeah, but just speaking about some challenges. So even though a lot of people hold to essentialism, a lot of people hold to dispositional modality, there are some challenges. Specifically with essentialism, you still have the irrelevance challenge.
Mm.
So a lot of philosophers have pushed back against fine, in not the sense that we should separate modal statements from essentialist statements. We should separate them. A lot of people have accepted fine to be correct with his counterexamples.
Mhm.
Modality and essentialism are different spheres of knowledge. But where they push back on is the grounding relation.
Yeah.
Essences ground our modal statements. Some people would say no, because there doesn't seem to be any relevance. Why is it the case that what my essence, what I am, grounds what's possible of me? Now, I personally don't see a lot of problem on this,
Yeah.
but there is sort of a burgeoning literature where people are sort of writing against spying. So anyone who's interested in this, I would say if you're deep diving into essentialism, do have a look at some certain individuals. There is a very good article by Penelope Mackey in a book. It's a book for fine where they sort of go through. I never know how to say that word. Is it a Fleischrift? I can't remember
We
how.
say Festschrift, but Americans are really bad at pronouncing stuff.
Yeah.
So.
Right. So yeah, there's one of them for fine, which was released about 2 years ago, which has a very good article where she argues against fine on this thing. So Penelope Mackey, and there's a few other people that have done this as well. And then with dispositionalism, one of the main challenges people have is there doesn't seem to be enough dispositions to ground all of our possibility statements.
Mm.
So let's say we're talking about let's say possibilities about the universe. You have to ground the possibilities about the universe on the dispositions that the universe has. But what about statements about things that happened before the universe, or
Mm.
when the universe came to existence, or things about the future of the universe? So the problem is that there doesn't seem to be enough dispositions to ground all of our possibility statements. Now, one person who's pushed back on this is Alexander Proust.
Yeah.
He himself has provided a way through theism. So he believes that even though many sort of entities do not have enough dispositions to ground various possibility statements, God can do it. So God can fulfill that role. So
Hmm.
he has the ability to do that for the universe, for other entities. So he sort of provided his way. But for people who are non-theists, they're not going to favor that approach.
Yeah, but that's so good because that's an argument. If you like this approach, hey,
Yes,
God can save
exactly.
it. You know, I love that.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So that is an argument people can formulate. And I don't think he even formulated as an argument for God's existence.
Sure.
But that is a research that someone can sort of put forward an argument there.
Yeah.
But irrespective of these challenges, I would say probably the contemporary field are sort of on this area of dispositionalism and essentialism. A lot of people, probably outside of philosophy, religion, are defending abstractionism and no one is defending Lewis. I would say that's
Yeah.
sort of under the water at the moment. Or that if someone is defending him, it's a modified version of Lewis.
Yeah.
And then with that branching view, that will fall into sort of the dispositional modality as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's super
Okay.
helpful. Dude, I keep
Great.
slowing us down. We're not gonna be able to get through
No, no,
all of
that's
this,
fine.
but
That's
I'm triaging stuff that I definitely
yeah,
wanna ask you.
yeah,
Um,
that's great. Yeah,
can we are we got some more on
yeah,
modality?
yeah. No, no. So we can move. We're going on to philosophy of time.
Nice, dude. Because yeah,
So
I definitely
yeah,
wanna talk about, yeah, presentism, eternalism, endurantism, and
exactly. Yeah, yeah,
perdurantism.
great.
Yeah.
So, yeah, with the philosophy of time, just sort of as it says in the tin, examines the nature of time and also its relation to the existence of reality. So, some of the key questions that people will be asking are, is time's passage an illusion, or is it actually a fundamental aspect of reality? Also, what is the nature of past, present, and future? Do these things exist? So, those are the type of questions that people will be looking at. And there are various theories that people have put forward, and sometimes they're called temporal ontologies. So some of the main ones, just putting it in front of you here, uh, uh, are presentism and eternalism.
Mm.
Now, I've just put forward, or I put here two philosophers, but there are many philosophers who have defended this. But Ned Marcosian is very famous for defending presentism, and Christine Miller in a debate book with uh, just left my mind. I forgot his name. Really great philosopher, by the way. But she has a debate book with him. Oh yeah, sorry, Nick Heffington.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah,
Nick
yeah, yeah.
Heffington.
I was gonna yeah.
Yeah,
He's
so
been on the
yeah,
podcast
she
a
has
couple
a
times. Yeah.
yeah, so she has a really good debate book. I think it came out last year or the year before, where she's defending eternalism and he's defending presentism,
Yeah.
and they sort of have a battle. So it's the same series as Oppie's book, that debate book that he had. It's a very good one. So I will tell your audience definitely do have a read of it.
That's a great
But
series.
anyways,
Yeah.
yeah, just understanding what presentism is. So presentism is just predicated upon two main ideas. So it's basically the idea that only the present exists and there is temporal passage or temporal succession. So present exists, that's all that exists. The future doesn't exist, past doesn't exist. And there is a real temporal passage that occurs with temporal succession. So that means that each moment of time changes in what is the present.
Mhm.
So let's say we have the attributes of being present, being past, being future, which sort of falls into this. You might hear this idea of the A theory of time.
Mhm.
This is actually different from presentism. So presentism is the temporal ontology. The A theory of time is just the affirmation of something called the A series.
Mhm.
So the A series is just the idea that there is a temporal order to reality that's directed, it's changing, and this order is ordered in terms of monadic properties of being present, past, and future.
Mhm.
So that's what the A series says, and the A theory just affirms that. So this is the idea then that there is a real present. That's all that exists is the present, and the present moment changes. That's what it means by temporal passage. So one moment was present, now it's past, and something else was present, and what's future now becomes present. So it just changes as it goes forward. So
And
that's
and
sort
and
of
the past moments no longer exist, and the future moments do not exist yet.
yeah, they do not exist yet.
Yeah.
So there's no ontological reality to the past and the future. Just the present has ontological reality,
Mhm.
and everything that exists within the present is a thing that exists. So Hitler doesn't exist anymore, and sentient robots do not. I have no clue they do exist, but
Mhm.
I assume that they do.
Yeah.
Sentient robots do not exist yet, but they could exist in the future.
Yeah.
But only thing that exists are things like us and other things.
I got a paper on that, why they may not exist, but,
Yeah.
yeah. Um,
um. Okay. So yeah, we have some challenges though. Maybe I'll throw that at you, and then we'll just have
yeah, yeah, yeah.
something. So some of the challenges to presentism, one of the famous ones would be its incompatibility with the special theory of relativity.
Mhm.
Now, this is where people who get their scientific hat on would be like, okay, this is important because even though, again, I don't have a naturalized epistemology, I don't believe that science has to determine our metaphysics. I do believe when science speaks about something, we do need to take that into account when we're doing our metaphysical theorizing.
For sure.
So if there's a very well-established theory, such as relativity theory, special theory of relativity, then that should play a role in our metaphysical thinking. And so one of the problems that you have is the relativity of simultaneity. So the idea that um, there is no objective present. So there is no objective reference frame, so frame of reference. and it's simultaneous. And so the problem that you have is presentism says there is an objective present that changes. It moves along. So if we can see like this sort of line, it just moves along and the present is changing. But what special theory of relativity says is it sort of says there is no objective present.
Mhm.
It is simultaneous, whatever the present moment is. And so you don't really have good empirical grounds to say that there is this present moment that exists and sort of moves along. So the problem that you have here is that you just have a challenge to this idea that only the present is real. Because when we've had experiments that have sort of shown special theory of relativity to be grounded upon empirical reality, we've sort of seen this idea that actually there is a simultaneity that comes to reality. And so it's relative. And so we don't have this objective present. So this is one of the arguments that some philosophers, so a very good paper is by a guy called Simon Saunders, a very good paper, where he's a philosopher of physics. And he really sort of argues that it's just a case closed with presentism when it comes to this problem. The special theory of relativity just shows that presentism cannot be true. So, yeah, there is a lot of people who have sort of put forward this as one
Yeah.
of the main challenges.
Josh, can I jump in with an example
Yeah,
here?
of course, of course.
So,
Yeah,
I think this will be a good example. So, for the folks who've seen like the movie Interstellar,
yeah,
they go on to one bigger planet, and because time and space are so connected, and the gravitational pull on the planet or whatever on space time, space or time changes differently on that planet than it does on Earth, and so. He goes to this planet, and like 7 years have passed, even though it's been 30 seconds or whatever, and that shows that there's not one time frame that's moving, but it's simultaneous because there's a different time on this planet because of its gravitational pull than, or I'm not saying the right word, but because of its
no, no,
gravity.
no. Really, it's the thing. I think it
Yeah,
paints a picture for the audience. Yeah, I
yeah.
think
So
that's good.
that's the objection, right? It's like the interstellar
Yeah,
objection.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. So you have that problem if it doesn't seem to correspond with some of our best science, and we do want our metaphysics to sort of correspond with it. And then you have the truth maker problem.
yeah.
So this is the problem of for those, and a lot of people hold to truth maker theory. Some people might be truth maker maximalists and say that all truths have truth makers,
Mm,
or some might say some truths have truth makers. But the key idea here is that truths need to be grounded on some form of reality. So some people say truth is supervening upon being or whatever. So the idea here is that something within reality needs to ground our statements that are taken to be true. But the problem that we have is how do we ground the truth of our past, our statements about the past, and our statements about the future?
mhm,
If I said to you, Adolf Hitler was a chancellor in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, what actually grounds that statement? Because Adolf Hitler doesn't exist anymore.
yeah,
And if I say sentient robots exist in 2050 or whatever, again, what grounds that statement? Because all we have is the present moment. Now, some people push back on this to say maybe we can have things existing within the present moment that ground our past statements. So, an example of this would be like dinosaurs. So, if I said to you dinosaurs existed millions of years ago, some people would say the fossils of dinosaurs are the things that ground the statement of there being dinosaurs in the past. But again, a lot of pushback on that point would be no, we actually need the things that the statements are about. There needs to be an aboutness to our truth statements.
yeah.
Now, they actually need to be about those things that they're talking about. So, fossils or things that we find in the present moment are not, they don't have that aboutness relation enough to be able to ground the truths of those statements.
Yeah, I could see. So I'm a truth maker maximalist. I think I love me some truth makers. I could see someone saying like, well, take the robot case. Let's say that you think it's metaphysically impossible, so we know that there won't be. So what's grounding the truth of the or what's grounding the falsity of that statement is about sentient robots in 2050 is presently we can examine the fact that that's metaphysically impossible, but things like Hitler, that's a empirical fact, so like you can't really ground. I guess you could look at your textbooks and stuff, but what's making those textbooks true? There's no obtaining state of affairs, there's no fact, because the
Yeah.
past doesn't exist any longer. So you can try it with modal stuff, but Hitler is possibly was the chancellor or whatever, and possibly not. So how do we know which one's true? I love that
Yeah.
objection, man. That's good.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's quite a good objection. So yeah, it's harder with the future statements, but with the past statements, because those things have already occurred. And again, we've got evidence of these things happening. What grounds the case of actually it being the case that Hitler existed as that person?
Yeah.
So you seem to not have the truth makers that you need. Yeah. So that's a big pushback there. Okay, then when we turn to eternalism is the opposite end of the temporal ontology scheme, in that it holds to the past, present, and future all existing simultaneously, and there is no temporal passage.
Mhm.
So time doesn't, there's no temporal succession. Our times do not change.
Mm.
Okay. So the way people view this is sort of like a four-dimensional block. So this is where sort of four-dimensionalism comes in when it comes to time. So you have this four-dimensional blocks universe, and this block has the past section as such, present section as such, the future section is us, but they're all there existing.
Mm.
And so what this view holds to, and this is something that Christine Miller brings out in the book, is this idea of permanentism. So the idea that everything always exists implicitly.
Mhm.
So whatever, Hitler always exists. He's always there. It doesn't matter if he's not existing here, he always exists. And the sentient robots, they exist already. They're
Mhm.
there. So eternalism just holds to everything that exists is already existing in that specific section of the block. It's just there. And then you have this idea then of the indexical present. So the present is in an indexical term, like here, like what we were talking about before with Lewis, like here and like actual now is an indexical term. So Hitler doesn't exist now, but all that means is he doesn't exist in the part of the block that I exist.
Mhm.
Present is just a part of the block that I exist. But the part of the block where Hitler exists, that's the present for him.
Yeah.
And so the present doesn't move to where we are now. We're just in an earlier part or later part of the block. See, but there is no sort of present moment as such as an objective present.
Mhm.
And so this is where you have that B theory coming in, which again is just the affirmation of the B series, which says that times are ordered with certain B relations. So like earlier than, later than, simultaneous with. That's all it is. So Hitler existing is earlier than us existing, but it doesn't mean that actually it's existing at in the past as such, and we are in the present.
Yeah.
And again, present is just picking out where we are in the block. Yeah.
The fill time stuff is some of my favorite to get into with people who think that philosophy doesn't matter. Because I'm like, well, tell me about time. Like, do you still like endurantism,
Yes.
perdurantism, block universe, all that stuff, dude? Because you can't really escape it, and it's so confounding to everyone. Augustine talks about this in the Confessions. What is time? I know it until you ask me. But to me, like, they all just have so many bullets to bite that it's just crazy. A theory of time is like, I understand some things. I understand like why like libertarians want it, or like open theists. I understand that, but there's a lot of bullets, and then you
Yeah.
go with the block universe, and you're like, okay, well, is Christ like still on the cross, like still suffering? Like it's just wild. There's so many bullets to bite all over the place, and I
Yeah.
kind of like that. There's so many thorns.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And so that sort of leads to that challenge, or the main challenge, where you have everything existing. And it's just problematic because Hitler is still doing the horrible things that he did as such.
Yeah.
He's just not doing it here.
Yeah.
So a good example that Miller gives as well is for example, I'm in London, and Sydney is in another country. Now Sydney is not here; it still exists, but it's just not in my location. It's the same thing with Hitler. Hitler still exists; he's still there. He's just not in our location of the block, but
Yeah.
he's still there. So it's a bit of a crazy, when you think about it, you're like, wow, that's just crazy. And like, again, theologically, like you're saying, Christ dying on the cross,
Right.
that's still occurring as such
Well,
in
and our
some way.
experience of the passage of time, where it's like, well,
Yeah.
that may be illusory. Maybe you can like figure out a way to explain it where it's not, but it's like, I feel like I pass through time, but that one seems tough on both accounts, right? Because you're like, what on A theory, it's like, what are you passing into? There's nothing there. What do you mean passing time?
Exactly.
And on B
Exactly.
theory, it's like, well, okay, but I'm not really, because that me who started this thought is still there starting that thought, you know? It's
Exactly.
wild.
And yeah, so I think that's the main challenge you have. It seems to be just intuitively the case that, time is changing. Like
Yeah.
we were talking about something, 1 minute ago, now we're talking about this. But something that people push back on, especially who have sort of scientific inclinations, would be science has shown us that a lot of things that we think to be the case are not really the case.
Sure.
And so just because it appears to be the case that time moves doesn't mean that it actually is the case. Um, and I sort of give this as sort of as an argument in the book as well for God in that area. So that God will want us to have the experience of time passing, to have more responsibility, to have a few other things, freedom of the ability to think we have freedom of choice. So all of those sort of things will be important for God to put, even though He might create a blocked universe.
Yeah.
So I sort of say there's an explanatory gap for someone who's not holding to theism, saying, why do we even have this weird thing of the passage of time? The theist can actually explain it, and I sort of have that in the book.
Dude, I love that.
Yeah,
I try to mix and match here a little bit, in the same vein as Joshua Sijuwade. I like theism plus moving spotlight, right? So it's
yeah,
like those watching on YouTube right now, you can see that, like, you can scroll around and look at the different spots, and you can watch different parts of this episode, but there's one present that's going through. And I'm like, dude, if we have theism, then we get to have it all. We get to have this, like,
yeah,
moving
yeah.
spotlight. But I know a lot of people don't like moving spotlights. So
Yeah, no, no. So there's Ross Cameron's done great work on that. So he's got a really, really good book. I think this is actually called The Moving
mm,
Spotlight Theory. A paper I published recently was actually doing something similar to that. It was using Sam Barron's view called priority presentism,
mm.
which sort of it's a combination of moving spotlight with eternalism with presentism.
Dude,
So yeah, if people are interested,
what's
look
that
up
paper
Sam
called?
Barron.
What's your
Uh,
paper called?
and the paper's called Elucidating Atemporality.
Nice.
So I was trying to explain like how atemporality can work. So I use like Sam Barron's work on this. So it's quite an interesting view. So even though I've sort of introduced these two areas, there's so much nuance in there that some people can, take from the eternalist camp and have a bit of
Yeah.
presentism, take from this and that. So it's a wide field, but I do sort of encourage a lot of you listeners to sort of delve deep into these areas.
I love
Yeah.
that, man. Hey, speaking of time, like how are you doing? Can we go through a couple more of these?
What good? Yeah, I'm good for
Okay.
time. Yeah. So,
Okay.
yeah. All
Um,
right.
I kind of want to skip over causality.
Yeah, we can do
Um,
that.
yeah, and maybe it'll come back up because we're talking grounding and stuff. But can we talk about Mereology?
Yeah, we can. We can. Skip. So I've actually got, but we can skip through persistence with everything.
Oh shoot, yeah,
Unless you,
endurantism and
you like that?
perdurantism. Yeah, we forgot about that.
Would you like that? My time is not. I'm not
Yeah,
really that
yeah,
into.
let's do that because
It's,
that stuff's really fun. Space-time worms and all that
yes.
stuff.
Okay. So yeah, another area it's sort of in the philosophy of time. It sort of goes into philosophy of space as well as such, because you're talking about objects. Is the idea of how do objects persist? So, do objects maintain identity even though they're changing? Because as we've already said, change seems to be just an evident feature of reality. Even though it might be an illusion as such, it does seem to be taking place. And the question is, well, when I am existing through different times, how could that even make sense?
Hmm.
Am I the same person the next minute later? And so you have these sort of three main theories that have been put forward. I would say the first two are sort of the main line theories, and then we have a third theory that we'll look at as well. So the first one's called endurantism, and I put again one of the main defenders of this. Other people have done as well. E.J. Lowe is a big defender of this. So this is just the idea that objects persist through time by being wholly present at each moment of time. So every moment of time that's different, you have an object persisting by just being wholly present.
Mhm.
So if we have ourselves and we have T1, we have T2, I'm wholly, all of myself is present at T1 and all of myself is present at T2. And so that's just the way that I'm existing. So it's this idea of whole presence at each different moment of time. Now, the main challenge you have with that, or one of the challenges, is something called the problem of temporary intrinsics. So this was argued against endurantism by David Lewis. And it's just the idea of how do we make sense of the possession of contradictory properties at different times.
Mhm.
So if you have a person standing up and you have a person standing down, sitting down. So you have someone standing up at T1 and not standing up at T2. How can it be the case that the same person has those properties? Because they seem to be incompatible
Mhm.
at these different times. And so some people say it goes against the indissolubility of identicals. So how can you have that to be the same entity, but they have these contradictory properties? So one of the pushbacks against this has been the problem of temporary intrinsics. But there is a way that Lowe and others have sort of tried to deal with this. And one of the ways is to see our property possessions as relations,
Mm,
relations to times. So it's not that I have the incompatible property of standing up at T1 and having the incompatible property of not standing up at T2. It's that I have the property of standing up at T1. So sort of a joint phrase of standing up hyphen T at T1.
yeah.
And then I have not standing up at T2. Now, these are uh, properties which are relation to times. So
Mm,
you have sort of, you sneak in the time into the property. So you're actually talking about different properties.
mhm.
So it's like me having two different properties that are not incompatible. So that's some way that people have tried to deal with that with endurances.
Does that have to do with the time or with the property itself, or just like it's just the instantiation of that property, right? Like,
So some people will take it as the property itself.
oh wow,
Some people will take it as actually the instantiation relation.
okay,
So the instantiation relation is what is different there. So some people just think it's a property, and you just have the property at T1,
yeah.
um, or you have it as you're bearing a different relation to that property at stage.
The relation one seems so intuitive to me. It's like you can have a billion different relations or an untold number, but like
Yeah,
why have so many properties in your ontology? I guess if they're both abstract objects, then you still have a bloated ontology, I guess. But
yeah,
sounds it just seems like relations are those kinds of things that you can have a bunch of, whereas
yes,
properties you don't want so many. Like it just
yes, exactly. Yeah, so I mean, a lot of, I would say that's probably the go-to option for a lot of people with this. So you just sort of relationalize in a way.
yeah,
Are properties. It's FUD.
yeah,
Um, and yeah, that's sort of the way that endurance but per-duratists don't like that approach. And I'll just sort of explain why.
yeah.
So yeah, endurance and sort of the arch endurance is David Lewis again. And his main idea is that objects persist through time by having different temporal parts at each different moments of time. So you have T1, you have T2, and I have a different temporal parts that bear these properties. So this sort of deals with the temporary intrinsics. So first, I'll just define what a temporal part is. So as I stated, there, temporal part, and this is coming from the work of Ted Sider. So he wrote a book called Four Dimensionalism, where he defines what a part is. So it doesn't come from Lewis. But a temporal part of an object X is an entity that exists solely at an instant, is part of X at that instant, and overlaps everything that is a part of X at that instant. So the way I like to see this is like a snapshot. So
Mhm.
if I was to take like a photo of you right now, and I'll take a photo of you the next instant, you just have these different photographs, these photos of these instants of time. That's your temporal parts. It's just these segments of you.
Yeah.
And why this deals with the problem is because it's not me, simpliciter, that's having these incompatible properties. It's just my different temporal parts.
Mhm.
So the same way that my hand might be picking up one object, and my other hand doesn't have that object, so it has these incompatible properties, it's not a problem because they're different parts of me. So the same way my temporal parts have these different intrinsic properties, and that's sort of a way of dealing with this problem.
I love thinking about Lewis's full ontology or his metaphysical picture with temporal parts and counterparts. So you have like all these counterparts, but they all are moving through time as well. So you have
Yeah,
like these space time worms, but like just to the max, dude. It's so
yeah,
wild to take like a god's eye view
yeah.
on his whole picture.
Yeah, so do you know what's interesting is that's actually what you find with externalism. So
Mm.
I'll just sort of unpack that now. So externalism is very, very similar. Like, as you can see, it's one of the definitions is exactly saying you persist through time by having temporal parts at each moment of time. But what's the difference between perdurantism and exdurantism? Or another name for it is it's called stage view or
Oh
stage
yeah,
theory.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. What the difference between them is just that the temporal parts are identified as the object itself, instead of um, uh,
Oh, that's right.
segments of that thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll just unpack this a little bit more. So Lewis believed with perdurantism that all of our temporal parts make up something called a space-time worm, which is the object itself. So Parker himself is just the collection of all of your temporal parts.
Mhm.
So I'm just speaking to a temporal part of you now, but if we were to get to, the totality of your life, we put them together, that will make up the object.
Yeah,
But experientism says no. Each of the temporal parts are the object itself.
that's
So
right.
at each instant of time, the object is being replaced. So you have one object, you have Parker now, you have another Parker the next minute, you have another Parker the next minute. So it's not actually or the next instant. It's not a part of you. It's actually the whole of you, which is being replaced at each instant of time.
Yeah.
Um, so what this means is that there is no space-time worm. You can affirm it if you want a space-time worm, but you don't. Most explainers don't. But most people will just say what you are identified as is just the thing existing at that instant.
And so
So
you are wholly present in each moment, but there's no.
you are,
Yeah.
but there is a four-dimensional view, because the idea
Yeah.
here is um, you then bear a counterpart relation. So the main defender of this is Ted Sider.
Mhm.
So he defended this view in that book called Four Dimensionalism. Another very good person is Catherine Hawley. I think she passed away a few years ago.
Mm.
She wrote a book. I think it's How Do Things Persist or something like that. So these are the main defenders, Catherine Hawley and Ted Sider. And Ted Sider puts forward the view. He borrows from Lewis, and he puts forward a temporal counterpart
That's
view.
right.
So instead of our counterparts existing in different worlds, our counterparts exist in different instants of time. So every instance of time, the counterparts are getting replaced. So
Mhm.
you have the counterpart of Parker existing right now. Then you have another counterpart of that object existing in the next instant, and another one being replaced all the time. So what people have is that you have all these counterparts existing sequentially. So it's not the same object, because with endurantism, you have the same object, the identical object existing at each moment of time. You don't have that.
Mhm.
The one object exists just in that instant, then it goes out of existence. Then you have the next one, and the next one is being replaced by different counterparts.
Yeah.
Now, why this view was put forward by Sider is because he believed that there's a problem with perdurantism with temporary intrinsics. So he said that when we have property possession, properties are possessed by the objects themselves.
Mhm.
They're not possessed by our parts. So when you have a temporal part bearing my attribute of standing up, it's not really me that's bearing it. It's just a part of me.
Mhm.
And that part of me makes me up as a worm, but it's not really me. So what he was saying is, when we say things possess properties, we're really talking about the objects themselves. And so for him, this is meaning then that each of the temporal parts have to be the object themselves. And so when I possess properties, really me possessing it at that instant.
Because, so on that's such a good objection. I totally forgot about Sider's view. Um, it would make Lewis's space-time worm exacerbate the problem,
Yeah,
because now there's this one thing that does have all these contradictory parts, and
yeah,
because you didn't go in for the tensed view, or you didn't slip, time into your properties, now they all exist in the block
ex-
in the 4D
exactly.
world. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a really, really big problem. One problem though with extrinsicism would be the idea of, again, the same Humphrey objection that you have
Yeah.
with Lewis is it really, do I really have, so for example, if, I was 5'1". Okay. I had the property of being 5'1". Well, me talking right now, this instant didn't have it, because I'm just one of the counterparts.
Yeah.
It was a counterpart existing, 10 years or 15 years ago. Not 10 years, I was a lot
Mhm.
taller than that. Maybe 20 years ago, that had that property. So how is it me possesses that property of having been 5'2" at whatever age I was?
Right.
So it seems to me we have a problem there. Now Sider does a similar move to Lewis, but he tries to say that it just is the entity, because I am in a counterpart relationship to that thing, so I can have that thing. So it's sort of the same type of move that Lewis makes, but that's probably one of the main objections that people have.
Mm. So,
Okay.
so where do you fall on this, these 3
Okay.
options?
So yeah, I definitely hold to some form of like a four dimensionalism, because I just think it doesn't work. You can't be really an endurantist with an eternalist view.
Mhm.
Like, it's quite problematic. So what I hold to is some form of endurantism. But I'm in my work, I argued for in the book, I argue for externalism, because I think objection that society puts forward is quite good against
Mhm.
Lewis's view.
Yeah.
Because Lewis only really um, I would say, motivated his view by saying this view deals with contemporary intrinsics. But then if his view doesn't really deal with it, then why should I hold to it? I should just hold to endurantism.
Yeah.
But because extrinsicism allows him to have what endurantism, perdurantism is trying to say, and also it takes from endurantism in some ways. Um, it sort of has a middle position that I like, and I'm sort of that guy who likes to pick middle positions and
Yeah.
things. Well, probably extrinsicism, But if there's real problems with it, I probably will fall into the Purduitism camp.
Okay. I like that. I still want to play with like the moving spotlight and say like, yeah,
Yeah,
maybe something like externism, but because there's an objective like present moment, even though the block exists,
yeah,
like we can still have consciousness and the appearance
yeah,
of time. But personal identity is still weird because yeah, feel like I am. Well, I don't know. Maybe you're wholly present. Yeah, we don't have to work it all
yeah.
out here, but
I mean, that's a paper. That's a paper to write. I
yeah.
mean, there could be, a way to work through these ideas. I do know that there was a paper on presentism and Purduitism,
Mm.
um, where someone was trying to argue that I think it was possible, and then there was a pushback on that. Um, and but I haven't seen other temporal ontology, so I think there's some work to be done there,
Dude, I love it.
which is
That's so much
yeah,
fun. Yeah, so
great.
let's jump in on
Where
Mereology.
do you want to get to? Yeah,
What
Mereology.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Um,
my other my Catholic audience might have heard Mereology or maybe the
yeah,
Protestants who are looking Mereology, Meros,
Mereology. Yeah.
parts. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a study of parts and wholes and their relationships. So if we use a term like everyday speech about, the parts of this, part of my body parts, or part of this, table or whatever. So it's something that we use a lot, but when we're studying mereology, we're trying to actually be more precise in our theorizing. What does it mean for wholes and parts to exist? Now, I would say the central theory within mereology is something called classical extensional mereology, so CEM.
Mhm.
So I would say this is the theory, and then everything else is sort of a minority position. And this is an idea which was developed by Leonard Goodman in the 40s. But then again, he found Lewis with everything. So Lewis was, I would say, the popularizer of it. And then you have Peter Simon's book, Parts, which is a very, very, very prominent book released in the 80s, 90s, which defended a classical mereological view. But then Lewis's view as well is very important. And so Lewis and Simons are probably the main people. Oh, there's a very good book, actually, sorry, that just came out for your audience. I think it came out in 2021 or 2022. It's just called Mereology, and it's by Achille Varzi and AJ Kortnoy up in St. Andrews.
I believe I have that
Um,
book. Yeah, I need to
oh yeah, well,
read
do you
that.
have it?
Yeah,
Okay, yeah,
gotta read that.
very, very good. So
Yeah.
it's sort of like the updated versions of Simon's book.
Mhm.
So a lot of people, I would say, a lot of people, if you want to know what classical meteorology says in the contemporary sense, do go and get that book.
Yeah.
It's very good. But yeah, just classical extensional meteorology, according to Lewis, just has three axioms. Parthood is transitive. So if A is a part of B and B is a part of C, then A is a part of C. It has this really strange one, which we're going to look at. It's really the main challenge, which is unrestricted composition.
Yeah.
Any collection of objects has a fusion. So a fusion is just a whole. So anything can make up a whole as long as there are plurality of things. And then you have the uniqueness of composition. So no two distinct objects have exactly the same proper parts. So these really are the three axioms that classical extensional mereology has. Now, there are other subsidiary axioms that people sort of catch out, but Lewis sort of just reduced them to these three things. That's why CEM is really like put forward as a very simple theory, because it's just predicated upon this idea. We have transitive parthood, we have unrestricted composition, and we have the uniqueness of composition. But now understanding why a lot of people have pushed back on this is because of it's quite counterintuitive, specifically unrestricted composition.
Mhm.
Because the idea here is if you just have the plurality thing. So, for example, I have a phone here, I have a mouse here. So these things make a whole, but they also make a whole up with Donald Trump's nose.
Yeah.
So you have Donald Trump's nose, you have my phone, you have my mouse here, and they make up an actual object, some freak object that has Donald Trump's nose, my phone, and my mouse together.
Yeah.
And so because mereology isn't restricted, things compositional wholes, they can make up anything, like literally wherever it is. It doesn't matter about location. So spatial location is not important. So whatever it is, as long as there's a plurality of things, there is a making up of those things. But there's a very good article that Kit Fine wrote. The name, I can't remember the name of the article, but he puts forward something called the monster objection,
Hmm.
where basically he's arguing, this thing that you just have monstrous objects exist within reality, which just go against our intuitive picture of reality.
Somebody always
Um,
uses a nose, and it's always, like, when I was in ontology class, we were talking about, like, Hillary Clinton's nose plus, like,
yeah,
some other
yeah,
it's
exactly.
so helpful to
Yeah,
just
I
throw a
don't know why
nose
to
in.
notice.
Yeah,
Yeah, but it's just a weird thing. So yeah, you have these monstrous objects that seem to exist, and you have to actually say these things exist within reality,
yeah,
even though intuitively you'll say no. Things are really parts of things when they have the same spatial location. At least they have the same spatial location or
yeah.
something.
Well, Josh,
So
can you put this in contact with, mereological universalism? I know, unrestricted composition better because I've studied it, in the artificial intelligence conversation, but, where does unrestricted composition, commit you to mereological universalism, or are those different things where
yeah,
is yeah, yeah,
Um, I mean, I would say that they sort of do.
okay,
No, I mean, it's sort of the same idea that
yeah,
there isn't sort of a restriction to what things exist as wholes and as mereological entities.
yeah,
So I think they sort of go part and part with
that's
it
what I
with
thought.
this idea of unrestricted composition.
Nice,
So it
part
sort of
part
falls into
part
the
nice.
CEM view.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't think you have to be a mereological essentialist and stuff like that.
Okay.
Yeah, and stuff like that. So that doesn't have to come with CM, but stuff like universalism normally would come with that package as well.
A
Um,
mereological nihilist would say, we're just we're being deceived, or, yeah, or just
yeah,
our common sense notion of objects is just wrong. There aren't
exactly. Yeah,
objects.
yeah, exactly. So I mean, he is. I would say Van Walden. I mean, he's sort of a famous one, but
Except for things
yeah, I
like
mean,
Caught Up in a Life, and then you're like,
yeah,
"Well,
caught up in the line. Yeah,
what's
those
that?"
sort
And
of
he's
things.
like, "Well, ask the scientists." And you're like, "Well, dang
Yeah,
it." Yeah,
yeah. So they would just deny there being any sort of neurological holes and stuff like that.
yeah,
But again, I would say that the working sort of position is CEM, so classical extensional mereology.
okay,
But what has sort of started to grow in interest is restricted accounts of mereology. So something called neo-Aristotelian mereology.
mhm.
So it's the idea here, again, this is because of Kip Fine. So with that paper that I was speaking about, he sort of put forward that. And then oh, her name just left my mind. She's really important as well. But you have another lady.
Is it Catherine? Is it right there? Kalinske?
Oh yeah, Kislicki. Sorry, I wasn't even reading my PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Catherine Kislicki and Kit Fine. Yeah, so they're the main guys. I would say Kit Fine was the guy who started it, and Catherine Kislicki is the person who she wrote a book called The Structure of Objects,
Mhm.
and then she had another book called Substance. Form, matter, and objects, or something like that, where she sort of really develops this view that wholes or entities that are mereological wholes can only be the case if they have recipes for their existence. So what that means is that things can only exist as wholes if there is some form of unifying principle of them. So this is a restrictive account of composition.
Mhm.
So there are not all of these, monstrous objects like noses and mouses and all those sort of things that make up objects. There are only things that exist if their recipes or their unifying principles are the things that allow them to. So she sort of goes into why it's near Aristotelian because she now introduces the form matter distinction. So she would say that material wholes are made up of matter, so material stuff, and then the forms are the things that give them their structure.
Yeah.
So anything that lacks that sort of formal structure isn't taken to be a mereological whole.
Mhm.
So that's why you wouldn't have those type of entities. Yeah.
I've gotten just a whole face full of neo-Aristotelianism through my philosophy studies because all or most of all my professors were neo-Aristotelians, and working in,
Yeah.
Brandon Rickenbaugh working in philosophy of mind, Paul Gould working in ontology. So
Yeah.
I've just got
Exactly.
so much, and it's hard to even think of
Yeah.
anything else because that's who taught me.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I would say that it's a really, again, because of you have like people like Kip Fine who have been so influential. So I would say like Hal Lewis was really influential sort of in that sort of 80s, late 80s, 90s, going into like his death in the early 21st century. And you sort of had that with Kip Fine. So a lot of people are like, oh, what's Kip Fine's thing? And they sort of jump on that, they jump in that sort of field because
Yeah.
I don't know why, but he just seems to strike gold whenever he's writing. So a lot of people are now sort of saying, yeah, this sort of neo-Aristotelian structured view of Mereology is what we need to be arguing for. But sort of the main challenge that people face with that view is trying to say, what is this? What is the unifying principle? Like, what actually is that thing?
Yeah.
So I'll say to you that Koslicki says, it's the form of the thing. But again, some people will not like that terminology. So, for example, like E.J. Lowe, who's a neo-Aristotelian, he doesn't hold to the existence of forms.
Mhm.
So he will push back uh, against Koslicki on this and say,
What's
actually, we
his
don't
what's
need
his
forms.
unifying principle? Like a bare
Yeah. So
particular or
if
something?
so uh, I think it falls into his full classical ontology.
Okay.
So if I remember correctly, he doesn't believe that forms are things. They're just you're unified by your kind membership and
Yeah.
stuff like that. I think that
Yeah.
would be his thing. So yeah, he would just say there's no need for something like a form. So
Well,
even though he's an Aristotelian, yeah,
because then sometimes people go in for forms and essences,
yeah,
and shoot, what's that fancy Latin word? Shoot, man. I'll think of it later.
yeah.
It's like a bare particular, but
Okay, yeah.
um,
It's not a substratum, is it?
no, because that's another one, right? That's a substratum, bare particular, um,
Yeah.
quiddity. No, no, not
Okay,
not not
okay.
quiddity. The other
Well,
one,
it's deity.
aseity,
But this,
hexaity,
yeah,
and then
yeah, deity, yeah,
hexaity. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
like this and stuff like that. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it
yeah,
gets
exactly.
so fuzzy when you get down to, because I think it has some pretty good explanatory power until you're like, "Well, what are you?" And it's like, "Oh no,
Yeah,
here we go."
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, I mean, there is a great divide in that. Something I bring up in the book. Even though I put one there, I don't think there is a second slide. But what I do bring up in the book is the idea that actually you can divide the field of metaphysics into this sort of neo-Aristotelian camp and this neo-Humean camp.
Mm,
So what I see is you see that a lot with Mereology. So where you see that divide is actually a lot of people who are neo-Aristotelian. So people who hold to grounding, people that hold to powers when it comes to causation, uh, people that hold to substances and all those sort of things, they will push back a lot when it comes to this idea of classical essential meteorology, and they will fall into that neo-Aristotelian camp. So you have people like Kip Fine, Shafar, you have Koslicki, you have David Armstrong, all those neo-Aristotelians, and then you have sort of Ted Sider and Lewis, who fall into the neo-Humean camp, who sort of take this view. So what I see is sort of there's a dividing contemporary metaphysics. Some people are neo-Humeans, but there's a great rise in neo-Aristotelian thinking.
mhm.
And you see that most explicitly sort of with Mereology.
Yeah, I love that. Um, Ross Inman was one, Substance and
Yeah.
the Fundamentality of the Familiar
Yeah.
was
Very, very good. Very
so,
good
like,
book. Yeah.
super beneficial and helpful for me, and then, Brandon Rickabaw's been working on that with,
Yeah.
JP Moreland, and so I kinda got in that route, and I'm kinda backtracking back up to the folks that you're
Yes. Yeah.
talking about, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Which,
Exactly.
I mean, that brings me to the mind body. I don't wanna
Yeah.
spend a ton of time on that. We talked about, a lot on the podcast, but something that I
Yeah.
think Rickabot, I'm pretty sure Rickabot brought this up, that, it's a the neo-Aristotelian take on substance dualism is actually really fun to
Yeah.
think through. It's kind of hylomorphic a little bit, maybe the
Yeah.
soul, is the form of the body. So the body's like a mode,
Yeah.
of the soul, and it's just got this exemplification relation plus properties, and you're like, "That's what the body is." So it really is your
Yeah.
body. I love that. I don't know, I just wanna wave at this. Do you have a particular do you I mean, you're Catholic, so I feel like you kind of have to have some kind of hylomorphism, but maybe
Yeah.
not.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. Thought I had a slide on this, but I realized I didn't. I don't know
Mhm.
why.
Hmm.
I actually thought I made a slide for everything. But with my own view, I'm a very big proponent of Lowe's metaphysics.
Yeah.
And so Lowe introduced something called non-Cartesian substance dualism.
Mhm.
So you have substance dualism, which is the general idea that you have these, I mean, the general most basic form of it, that you have these two substances, let's say a mental substance and you have a physical substance, and there's some form of relation between them. Um, Lowe then put forward a non-Cartesian view, which is just the idea that you have a mental substance and you have a physical substance. But the key thing is that the mental substance can also exemplify physical properties.
Mm.
So what you normally have with substantialism is that the mental properties are just grounded upon the mental substance, and that's it.
Right.
Physical properties rather than physical one. And the key point that he tries to say is actually no, that the physical properties are also possessed by the mental substance itself. but the physical substance doesn't
Yeah.
possess the mental. So that's why there is an identity relation. Why he likes to hold to this view is because for him it makes the best sense of the unity of mind and stuff like that. But also it allows us to have a view where where you have something which fits with the scientific view of how sort of, have sort of an assumption of physicalism. So we don't just have this free floating soul that's, floating everywhere. We have a mental substance that's needed to ground our mental properties, but it also exemplifies all of these physical properties as well.
Yeah.
I
You get
haven't seen,
interactionism.
yeah.
Yeah.
So there is sort of an interaction. There's a closer relationship
Yeah.
to that.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like Lynn Rudder Baker's view, sort of a constitution. You don't have the statue and the lump. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
so it sort of gives that example, but he doesn't say. He says it's an embodiment relation um, between the mental substance and the physical substance. And yeah, so that's sort of the view I like it. If I'm honest, I haven't done as much deep diving into it. In the book itself, I do sort of argue for non-Cartesian substance dualism. And I think it's an area that I would say I love a lot of people to research in metaphysics a lot more. Because again, with Lowe, it seems to be like a lot of his ideas were ahead of the curve.
Mhm.
But then he sort of died. He unfortunately died before people really were wrestling deeply with a lot of the stuff that he put forward. So like even with, for example, with grounding, Lowe had a paper in 2009 about grounding, but he never used the term grounding.
Mm.
Um, and, and I think even in 2005, he had a relation that's very similar to grounding, but never used that terminology. Um, but it is speaking, it's literally a relation of grounding.
Yeah.
And so what's interesting, he was ahead of the curve, but he died before all of these sort of discussions were really, sort of heating up and stuff like that, which is a big shame.
Yeah, seriously. Um, dude, this is awesome. This has been so much fun.
Yeah, it's been so
Can
good.
I kind of want to skip over free will.
Yeah, we can do that.
I know you're
Yeah,
in the book, you're going in for libertarian free will,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
which
Yeah.
is
So I
like,
mean, a lot is,
I get
yeah,
it. I get it. But it's uncharacteristic for you because you're the guy who always pulls anything. And it's like, hey, if you want some of this, you can have some of this. And you're like, just free
yeah,
libertarian free will. I'm like, whoa. All the compatibilists
yeah.
are like, no, what are you
I,
doing, man?
I'm just, I just can't deal with the moral responsibility issue. Like,
Yeah.
I get what everyone's trying to say. Like, if you can have a compatibilist option, you can ground. It's just not persuasive for me. So I do like Robert Kane's work a lot.
Sure.
And again, I think too many people are passing away. I think he died this year or
I
something,
think
or
so.
early this
I
year.
think I remember that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, Robert Kane. Yeah. So he did great work, and I've been quite persuaded by his sort of libertarianism,
Yeah.
which again tries to bring in a view that sort of fits with scientific knowledge or the way that we understand the way that the world works,
Yeah.
but also allows room for there to be. So he allows room for determinism, but so long as there is some chain of indeterminism in our choices.
Yeah.
So I do like it. So it's sort of like again a middle way between a hard determinist view and sort of a incompatibilist view.
Well, you have
Yeah,
this self-forming condition,
yeah,
that,
yeah,
yeah, your activities, like, or your, choices need to be self-forming, and I'm like, "But source compatibilism, like,
yeah,
we want that too," like, so
yeah, yeah,
that's another
yeah,
conversation probably for another time.
yeah. I
Um,
think I'm sort of open again with that, those sort of
I
things.
love it, man. I
Yeah,
wanna just, as we're closing out here, philosophy of
yeah,
physics, um,
yeah,
this is really fun. I kind of have a antagonistic relationship with like things that say science when it's just follow the science
yeah,
or scientists said this, and I'm always like, well,
yeah,
and I fall back on the metaphysics, and I'm like, well, actually you're doing philosophy of science and stuff like that, and that's
yeah.
you need to be a philosopher to do that, or you need to
Exactly.
understand. But then I go into like zoology, and I'm like, I love zoology, I love all the actual sciences, but when people say
Yeah,
science, so
yeah,
I was really excited to see that you're giving a treatment of the philosophy of physics. I don't see a lot of philosophical theologians doing that. I don't see a whole ton of philosophers who aren't specialists in the philosophy of physics who go in on it. So I was really excited to see a
yeah,
metaphysician
yeah,
actually giving it its due. I know some do, but I'm just saying on the whole, I don't see as many people go into that field. So this was
yeah.
awesome, man. This is so fun.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, thank you so much. So yeah, let me just move forward to that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's what I was looking at was sort of an area of science. So you have obviously science, which the theoretical physicists is they're not really going to be caring about the metaphysical questions. They want to make the calculations, perform the experiments, the experimental physicists. and they don't really care about, the ontological implications.
Hmm.
But there is a growing area called, as you were saying, the philosophy of physics,
Hmm.
where people are trying to actually say, well, what are the foundations, the fundamental foundations, the metaphysical, ontological foundation of our best theories? And so they've done this with quantum mechanics. So it used to be called interpretations of quantum mechanics, but it's now sort of being changed to like the foundations of quantum mechanics,
Hmm.
and that's what they try and call it. So this just sort of investigates, well, what are we, when we ontologically are speaking about the smallest parts of reality, quantum mechanics theorizes over, what are the implications? What do they sort of, what are they trying to put forward ontologically speaking? Um, and so one of the main problems people look at is the famous measurement problem.
Hmm.
So this is sort of the idea that, if I can just put it most simply, that when a scientist is making an observation, actually, no, I've got to take a few steps back. Okay.
Hmm.
Uh, but there's something called the superposition principle within quantum mechanics. And this is the idea that there is something called a wave function. So the wave function is just a mathematical tool at a general level, a mathematical tool, which expresses the possible configuration states of a quantum system. So if we're talking about a particle here, and we have, let's say, a spin up and spin down state
Hmm.
of whatever it is, uh, there is when we say there is a superposition, we're saying that the particle, the electron, whatever it is we're talking about, is in both of these states simultaneously.
Hmm.
So it's spinning up and it's spinning down. It's positioned to the left and positioned to the right, whatever.
Yeah.
And so what we have here is that we have all of these possible configurations of the particles we're talking about being realized. And so you see this with two famous, well, one thought experiment and one real experiment. So you have the double slit experiment, and you have the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment.
Yeah.
Which your listeners probably would have heard of.
Hmm.
But so I'll go with the Schrodinger's one because it's a bit simple. So you have a cat in the box, and you have a Geiger counter, which sort of measures when, let's say, a particle is decomposing or something like that. And you have a vial of poison. So you have these these things existing in a closed box. And if the particle decomposes, then the Geiger counter will see that, and it will then um, break the vial, the vial, and the cat will die. If it doesn't decompose, then the cat will be alive. Now, according to the superposition principle, the particle needs to be in both of those states at the same time. It needs to be in the state of, let's say, decomposing and not decomposing. Okay. And it's in those states at the same time. That means then that the cat also has to be in the state of being alive and being dead at the exact same time, because the vial has been broken and the vial hasn't been broken at the same time. And then whenever we open the box, we open and we never see a dead and an alive cat at the same time. We see one of those states being the case. Now, this is then the issue called the measurement problem. When we ever observe any of these sort of quantum systems, we always observe them in a determinate state.
Yeah.
We never see them in a superposition state of being spin up or spin down. We either see it being spin up or we see it being spin down.
Mm.
We either see the cat alive or seeing the cat dead. And so this is the measurement problem, because it's saying, why is it that the wave function takes this sort of state of being determinate whenever it's being observed? Whenever we open the box, it's in this determinate state.
Yeah.
Whenever we close the box, this is a superposition state. And it's not just us, it's whenever any measurement is taking place.
Right.
That could be observational measurement or through instrumental, through anything. It always goes into this determinate state. Why is it the case? That's sort of the measurement problem.
And they call it the collapse of the wave function. It's
Yes,
collapsing
exactly,
down
yeah.
to like a particle to a determinate state.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So what's happened then is that there's been some interpretations that have been put forward to try and make sense of this. Now, the key interpretation, so if anyone's ever going to learn philosophy of physics or even open up a physics textbook, just a general physics textbook, this is the interpretation that you'll see. It's called the Copenhagen interpretation, developed by Niels Bohr and Heisenberg. And basically, it's just the idea of biting the bullet and shutting up. That's literally it.
Yeah.
So it's just saying, it just posits that, yes, the wave function collapses and it collapses upon measurement. That is it. Okay. But we don't have any ontological mechanism why this is the case.
Mhm.
So some main challenge that people have here is, well, you still have the question of why is it the case that the wave function does collapse in this way upon measurement? Now, people who are scientists will say, it's not my job.
Yeah.
It's my job to make the measurements, and that's what happens. But it's not my job to explain the ontological reasons why this actually takes place.
Yeah.
And so, because of people have been dissatisfied with this interpretation, a lot of alternative interpretations have been put forward in the foundations um, of quantum mechanics.
Yeah. Have you
Now,
have you heard so this is where some of the woo-woo stuff gets in, and people are like, it's consciousness that collapses the wave function. Others will say, it's proof, or it can be evidence for the simulation hypothesis, that is rendering, right? So like if the simulators want to
yeah,
save memory, they don't render anything that a conscious being is not looking at. So when we look at it, it collapses back down from a wave to a particle. And I used to be like, that's so stupid. Now I'm like, that's actually pretty fascinating if you want to
yeah,
try to, like,
yeah,
I think there's problems with the simulation hypothesis, but you
yeah,
get a lot of the weird stuff because of this weird phenomena at the quantum
exactly, yeah,
level.
exactly. Yeah, but what is interesting is that what I was trying to say is conscious observation is not needed to collapse the wave function.
Right.
So
Cause
when people
yeah.
do say that,
Yeah.
yeah, it's any form of measurement which could take place by just some particle interacting with another and being entangled and stuff like that. So
Mhm.
it's not technically just like us seeing it; it
So good.
happens all the time,
Yeah.
even without any conscious subject. So
Yeah.
yeah, so that'll probably be the pushback some people will have with that. But yeah, exactly. This is where you sort of get weird ideas, and that sort of leads to our alternative theories.
Yeah.
So we have, I would say, three mainline alternative theories that have been put forward. Um, the first one is Bohmian interpretation. So some people might hear it. It's called the pilot wave theory.
Mhm.
So it's the idea that there is sort of there's this hidden wave that guides um the wave function to collapse. So it's putting forward like a mechanism to explain. So it's trying to say, yes, Copenhagen interpretation, I'm going to sort of explain it. And the mechanism behind it is that there is this sort of wave, this pilot wave that's guiding the um the specific, let's say, quantum system to collapse in this specific way. So there is something behind it. And there's also this idea that there are sort of these hidden variables. So there are these hidden determinate states already that the particles are in that we just don't theorize over when we're doing our theorizing. So it's just this idea that there's this hidden sort of variables and waves as well that's sort of guiding this determinate state. So sort of a way to put an ontological framework to the Copenhagen interpretation. But then one which is completely different from Copenhagen and Bohmian is the many worlds interpretation.
Mhm.
And this is the one that I think a lot of people find interesting. Again, because it's similar to what you're talking about with sort of multiverse theories and stuff like that, Marvel universe.
Yeah.
But this was put forward by a guy called Hugh Everett III. Now, he actually put forward this idea in his dissertation, but it wasn't, I think, didn't it wasn't well received at that time when he put forward this idea of the many worlds. Um, it was sort of I think he wrote it a lot larger, and then he had to reduce it down because his PhD supervisor did not like what he was saying,
Hmm.
and it was sort of going against the orthodox view of the Copenhagen and then sort of Bohemian stuff. So it wasn't really taken seriously until later in the 90s, where I would say the main guy now going into sort of the 21st century is David Wallace,
Hmm.
who used to be at Oxford. I think he's at Pittsburgh now or
Yeah.
something like that.
And then
He's got a
on the
very
popular level, Sean Carroll has been, clanging this
yeah,
gong for
Sean
a long
Carroll,
time. Yeah.
really good.
Yeah.
Really, really good. So I will recommend everyone probably leave Wallace's book or get Sean Carroll's book. He's got I even forgot the name of it, but he has a very good book on it. And he's very good
Something
on
deeply hidden, is that the one, or?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And he's really good on YouTube as well with his explanations of it. But yeah, basically, the many worlds theory is the idea that we have these superposition states. So we have the dead cat and the alive cat, but they're not actually happening in the same reality. They're happening in different branches of the wave function.
Mhm.
So the wave function branches to make up these different worlds. So if we're being more precise, the idea here is that the wave function evolves according to something called the Schrodinger equation.
Mhm.
And as it's evolving, it then branches off. So literally every single millisecond of the day, there is a branching of the wave function. Why this happens is because there is something called decoherence, where there is an entanglement of all of the subatomic particles with the larger macroscopic things. So the particle in the box is entangled with the cat, which is entangled with the other parts of the environment. So what happens is that the dead cat is entangled with all of the parts of the environment, and that makes up one branch.
Yeah.
And then we have the alive cat, which is entangled with other parts of the environment, which makes up the live cat world. So you have all of these different worlds where these superposition states have occurred, but they're not occurring in the same world as such.
Yeah.
So you just have these multiple worlds that which is
Yeah.
quite interesting.
It's he goes in on like the reasoning for this, at least from Carroll, because I've heard mostly from Carroll on this, Sean Carroll, is it like you said, it's really similar to Lewis, where it's like, hey, look, I get that it's crazy, but the explanatory power is here. Or Carroll always
Yes.
says like, I'm trying to take the math seriously. And you're like,
Yes,
yeah, but there's
exactly.
some common sense intuition stuff, which is like, why? Yeah, okay, I get it, but if you're deep into that work, it sounds crazy, but they're really really smart guys, so you should take them, listen to
Yeah,
their reasons.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And what he says also is that he sees it as the simplest option because
Mhm.
you're not tweaking with the science. So with all the other interpretations, with the Boolean and then GRW after it, you have sort of a tweaking with the physics, the quantum physics, to make sense of this. What he's saying, no, all you have is the Schrodinger equation and the wave function that's evolving according to the Schrodinger equation, and it leads to this happening.
Yeah.
That's all you have. So there's no tweaking of the science of the matter.
Yeah.
And so that's what's quite important for him, if I remember correctly. Now, one of the main challenges though is the idea of determinism. So it takes probability out of quantum mechanics because all of the states of the wave function exist in a world.
Yeah.
So it seems to be determined already. So you don't have any probabilistic system.
Mhm.
And then also, how do you make sense of how the branching occurs? That's
Right.
something that some people,
Yeah, there's, like, no there hasn't been a mechanism explained. I have
yeah,
heard, like, the quantum measurement results in the branching of the universe, and it's like, I don't know why that would be the mechanism to split off entire
yeah,
universes, or, like, you can go in some more
yeah,
woo-woo stuff if you want. That's kinda fun,
yeah.
but
But
yeah.
even Carroll says that in that book, actually, he says that every time there is a chaotic, a classic chaotic, uh, classic chaotic event that occurs in our bodies. So, for example, any sort of decay in our body of any of our cells that branches the wave function.
Whoa.
So, and that was, and I think he said it's like 10 to the power of something happens, you know, every second of the day.
Yeah, that's
So he's saying that all the wave function is branching off in all these different worlds in all of these different ways.
yeah.
I would say that there's a very good article that was written by, I can't remember her name, but she actually analyzed the many worlds interpretation in light of theism, and she put forward some arguments against the many worlds view if you're a theist.
Nice.
Because she was saying it makes, I think, the problem of evil more challenging and a few other things as well.
Mm,
So I think she's at Oxford, and there was one paper I remember reading, I can't remember her name. If anyone is interested, just write in many worlds and theism or stuff like that, and it should come up. But it was
nice.
quite interesting. Yeah, she took that take.
Well, let's end here with, where do you come down on, these 3? I mean,
Yeah,
probably
so
something in the middle.
yeah, no, I'm normally the middleman, but I actually take the Copenhagen interpretation.
Okay.
But again, I use this as an argument for God because what I then say is that this provides good grounds for why the wave function collapses. We have a mechanism. Theism provides an ontological mechanism. God wants to collapse a wave function because if everything was in a superposition, we wouldn't be able to gain scientific knowledge, for example. We also, because the entanglement of the microscopic with the macroscopic, this will then cause superpositions for macroscopic objects. So you wouldn't have things like free will, you wouldn't have moral responsibility because everything would exist and just be there. So my main idea is that God will want to collapse a wave function because it will allow us to have scientific knowledge, it will allow us to have um, free will and moral responsibility. So I have that in the book. So I just say, actually, I don't mind the Copenhagen interpretation. It can work and that we can put forward as a theist explanatory sort of system for it. But also theism, I would say, is when I first started out, I did take the many worlds view when I was in the book.
Sure.
And then I just said, actually, you know what? Many worlds view is crazy itself. So I want people to actually say, you know what? I have, the Copenhagen interpretation is the orthodox one. and I can hold to that and hold to God, instead of saying, "Oh, I need to hold to the many worlds view and hold
Right.
to God as well." But if I'm honest, theism can fit with any of them. The
That's
high
the best,
bursting
dude.
into
That's the best
yeah,
is because if it can make sense of multiple views, then it's like, well, that's really, really good. As long as
yeah,
it's not superfluous, you're like, oh, it can be compatible. No, no, it actually, has explanatory power on the many worldview if you hold to that, or on the Copenhagen, so
yeah,
that just to me adds more explanatory power to theism and makes it a more preferable option.
exactly,
So I love
exactly,
that. So
exactly.
so even
Yeah,
but I'm like you, man. I also don't want to put forward the crazy one, even if I like it the most. I'm like,
yeah, yeah.
we can talk about
Is
the
the
crazy
one.
if you like it. Let's do that, but not if you
Yeah,
don't have to.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's the thing. So I was saying the bare minimum, you want to go the Copenhagen interpretation. Okay, yeah, God explains it. But if you like Sean Carroll really likes many worlds, and I'll say, okay, then what's the ground of all these worlds? Well, we have God who grants his wave function
Yeah.
and stuff like that. So yeah, it works with everything. And so theism always, comes out the end at the top.
I love that, man. That's so good. I love the way you think. I think
Thank
that
you.
we're kindred spirits. You're just, way
Yeah.
further down the line, so it's really helpful for me. Yeah.
No, thank you so much, Parker. Again, I'm always blessed to come on your channel. You have such a lovely heart, and the way
Mhm.
it's just a conversation. It's not like you're being interviewed. And I really enjoy it. And yeah, I hope your audience have enjoyed this as well.
Thanks, man. Yeah, this book, you have the ontological argument book. Please, like, let's do one on that. And there's so much more
Yes,
that we can talk in here. You're a super busy guy. If you guys can't tell, he's also super jacked, so he's always lifting too. He's super busy, dude. But if I can coax you into coming back, like, let's do more. I always love talking with you,
yeah,
man.
I'll be happy to.
Awesome,
Yeah, thanks so much, Parker.
awesome.
Thanks again, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah. All
Thank you.
right, folks, that's gonna have to do it for now. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.